Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I was on one of my first solo hiking trips in Japan, attempting to climb Mount Fuji during the off-season. Teaching English in Tokyo had been rewarding, but after 6 months, I needed to escape the city's constant buzz. The trail was breathtaking. It wound through ancient forests before emerging above the tree line, offering spectacular views of the surrounding countryside. About 2 miles into the ascent, a faster hiker overtook me. Rather than simply bow politely and continue on, as is typical in Japan, he stopped and matched my pace. He wore an immaculate black business suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase, extremely unusual attire for hiking, especially on Fujisan. We struck up a conversation in Japanese, though he occasionally switched to unnervingly perfect English. Nothing particular was strange about what we discussed, but something felt deeply wrong about him. He was too polished, too precise. His friendliness felt artificial, almost mechanical. Every smile seemed calculated, every gesture rehearsed. Have you ever watched those uncanny valley robots that try to mimic human expressions? This man was like that, almost perfect, but with something fundamentally wrong underneath. His enthusiasm felt hollow, his laughter empty. It was as if he'd learned human behavior from a manual, but couldn't quite get it right. I remember him telling me, in that too perfect English, how he enjoyed testing himself against nature. But lately, nothing felt challenging enough. "Nothing makes me feel alive anymore," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Nothing gives me that thrill it used to." The way he emphasized the word thrill made my skin crawl. The businessman's presence was really unsettling me, so I made an excuse about stopping to check my map. He kept hiking, and I thought that was the end of it. I had an amazing rest of the day as I climbed higher, and as I hiked, his strange behavior slipped further from my mind. I found a beautiful camping spot on a small plateau jutting out from the mountain's face and settled in for the night. As darkness fell, as happens to all of us when we're alone in unfamiliar territory, I started getting increasingly anxious. My mind kept jumping back to how wrong that man had seemed, how he'd acted like something pretending to be human. To ease my nervous mind before going to sleep, I set my hiking knife in easy reach, right next to my head. I eventually dozed off after listening to several episodes of a history podcast through my earbuds. I slept unusually soundly, not waking once the whole night. When I woke in the morning, I felt unusually well rested and content. That is, until I went to grab my stove from my pack. The location of my pack wasn't the issue. It was where I'd left it, leaning against a boulder about 5 feet from my sleeping pad. No, what really disturbed me was that every single pocket was open. All the zippers were unzipped, all the snap closures undone. The sleeping bag compartment was open. The interior mesh pockets were open. The buckle closures on my stuff sacks were all clicked open. Inside the bag, nothing was taken, and the bag hadn't been moved, but literally every pocket was open. I started to panic. I always double-check my gear. It's become second nature after months of living in detail-oriented Japan. I knew I'd closed everything the night before. In growing fear, I looked down to where my knife lay on the ground next to my sleeping pad. Sure enough, the safety strap that held it to its sheath had been unsnapped. Something or someone had methodically opened every single closure on my gear while I slept, without waking me or disturbing anything. The thought sent ice through my veins. I set what must have been a speed record getting off that mountain. Back in Tokyo, I later heard stories from local hikers about a mysterious businessman who appears on the mountain trails during off-season, always impeccably dressed, always alone. Some say he's the ghost of a salaryman who died on the mountain, endlessly repeating his last climb. Others insist he's something that was never human at all, just wearing a human shape. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I do know that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't what might hurt you, but what simply want you to know that they could have. This happened to me 30 years ago, but I remember the feeling of fear as if it were yesterday. I was in university studying biology and taking part in a unique field research course in the Scottish Highlands. The course culminated in a 3-day solo wilderness survival exercise. We were each assigned different areas of the Highlands to study local flora and fauna, miles apart from each other. We were allowed to take only the essentials: a backpack, empty water bottle, sleeping bag, research equipment including sample collection tools, 6 matches, rope, a tarp, a change of clothes, extra socks, water purification tablets, a small cooking pot, and a field journal. We weren't allowed to bring food or water, since part of our training involved identifying edible plants and finding water sources. Once I was dropped off, I had to hike inland to find a suitable research spot. First, I had to place a small flag on a tree near my drop-off point, so I could be located 3 days later for pickup. I was absolutely in my element, just nature, science, and myself. I had no fears, even as night began to fall. I enjoyed the sounds of the highlands all around me, and didn't mind not having a tent. I built a small fire and started documenting the day's botanical findings in my journal. The sense of peace was overwhelming. I slept well that night, but woke up thirsty. My search for a water source began, and I was delighted to find a small stream. I let the water settle in my pot, added the purification tablets, and boiled it for good measure. The taste was awful, but at least I was hydrated. Everything went smoothly, and I was gathering fantastic data for my research until the last day. It was early afternoon, and I was cataloging some rare moss species when I heard the sound of movement in the distance. Through the gaps in the ancient pine trees, I spotted someone with binoculars, observing me from the hillside. My first thought was that it must be one of the course supervisors checking on students, but something felt wrong. The figure was too still, too focused. I pretended not to notice and continued my work, but kept watching from the corner of my eye. They remained there unmoving for nearly an hour. When I finally looked up directly, the figure was gone. My gut told me something was wrong. I gathered my research materials quickly and moved to a different location. As I walked, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps following me through the heather, always keeping just out of sight. I found a new spot and resumed my work, trying to stay calm. Through my hand lens, as I was examining a specimen, I caught a glimpse of movement reflected in the glass. The figure was back, closer now, still watching through binoculars. I packed up immediately and started hiking toward what I hoped was the direction of the pickup point. I heard the footsteps again, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right, but never visible. The weather started to turn, typical for the highlands, and a thick mist rolled in. The footsteps grew closer. I started running, my research samples scattering from my pack, but I didn't care anymore. In the mist, I nearly ran straight into a forest ranger's vehicle. I told him who I was and what had happened. His face grew serious as I described the figure with the binoculars. He told me I'd done the right thing running a young researcher had been assaulted in the same area the previous week, and they'd been searching for the perpetrator. He drove me to the base camp, where I learned that another student in my class had experienced something similar. A figure watching them through binoculars, following them through the highlands. They'd scared them off by using their emergency whistle. Later, during the debriefing, our professors revealed that several similar incidents had been reported in that area over the years. Always the same description: a figure with binoculars, watching, following, but never approaching directly. The local police had never managed to identify them. What's most disturbing is that when I developed the photographs from my research project, there was something strange in several of them. In the background, barely visible in the highland mist, was a dark figure holding binoculars. Even in photos, I was certain I'd taken before I first spotted them. If there's anything to be learned from this, it's to always trust your instincts and never do field research alone. The Scottish Highlands hold many secrets, and not all of them are natural history. I just returned from a 2-week kayaking expedition down the Dniester River with my friend, documenting the ancient caves and cliff monasteries along its banks. I've got a terrifying story to share from the very last night of our journey. We were camping on a remote riverbank, surrounded by limestone cliffs, when something happened that I still can't fully explain. For some background, we'd been filming and camping along the wild riverbanks throughout the trip, just the two of us. It was an exhausting but rewarding experience paddling all day, setting up camp at night, cooking over a fire, and getting by in the wilderness while lugging around our camera equipment. But that last night felt different. It spent a long day on the river, filming the ancient cliff formations and collecting interviews from local villagers about river legends. We were both exhausted and ready to call it a night. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up needing to relieve myself. My friend was still snoring away in his tent, so I quietly made my way down to the river's edge. The air was cool, the river was flowing gently, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of the willows in the wind. The moonlight reflected off the water's surface, creating an ethereal scene. It was just bright enough to see the basic shapes of things, but not enough to make out clear details. It felt peaceful until it didn't. As I'm standing there, I hear a noise. It was a sharp splash, something moving through the water. My first thought was it must be a fish, but then I heard it again, louder this time, closer. My heart immediately started racing. I tried to stay calm, thinking it was probably nothing. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I froze midstream, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I slowly looked up, and that's when I saw it. There, just 8 feet in front of me, half submerged in the river, was something I can't quite explain. It wasn't fully visible, but what I could see was unlike anything I'd encountered before. The shape was vaguely humanoid, but distorted, like looking at a reflection in rippling water. Its outline seemed to shift and flow with the river current. But its eyes, those eyes were terrifyingly solid and real, reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural green glow. I couldn't tell where the water ended and the creature began. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It felt like an eternity. I remember my mind racing, trying to process what I was seeing. I'd heard all the local legends about river spirits and water demons, but nothing could have prepared me for this moment. The fear was so primal, so raw in that moment. I realized how small and vulnerable we really are. The creature didn't make a sound. It didn't splash or move much, just stared at me with those glowing eyes, and I stared right back. It was like we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. My body felt like it was frozen in place, and I couldn't even tell you what was going through my mind. I know I was in total fight or flight mode, but I couldn't do either. Then finally, the thing shifted slightly, and I could see ripples spreading out from where its body met the water. That was when I thought for sure it was going to lunge at me. I was about to lose control of my bladder for real, and that's when it happened. The creature sank back into the river, as silently as it had appeared, leaving nothing but gentle ripples on the surface. I don't know if it was luck, or if it had simply decided I wasn't worth the trouble, but I was shaking as I slowly backed away toward camp. My mind was still racing. I stumbled back to my tent and woke up my friend to tell him what happened. Of course, he wasn't convinced at first. No way, man. You probably just saw a beaver or something. He was still half asleep and tried to rationalize it. I was still in shock, so I let him talk me down. If it was something supernatural, he said, you probably just startled it. These rivers are ancient. Who knows what lives in them? To be honest, I wanted to believe him. I was exhausted, physically drained from days of kayaking and barely sleeping, and I really didn't want to deal with the implications of what I'd seen. But then it happened again. It wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a loud splash, closer this time, right outside our camp. I sat up instantly, listening hard. I pressed my ear to the tent wall and heard something moving slowly, deliberately through the shallow water at the river's edge. I didn't wait to figure out what it was. I immediately looked out the tent's screen window, and there it was, the same shifting, fluid form. But this time it was dragging itself up onto the bank. I could see its body rippling like liquid glass in the moonlight, leaving a trail of glowing water behind it. My heart was in my throat. It was like we were being hunted. I immediately started yelling. I don't even remember what I said, but I was screaming into the dark, trying to make myself sound bigger, scarier. I grabbed my paddle, ready to swing it if I needed to. My friend shot out of his tent at this point, and we both knew we had to act fast. He was packing up his stuff frantically, but I was too rattled to be helpful. I just kept shouting. After a few moments of chaos, we got into our kayaks and took off down the river. We paddled furiously as far as we could, not stopping until we found a new campsite on the opposite bank, near a small village. It was pitch black by this point, and neither of us said much. I don't think either of us could sleep after that. The next morning, we went to a local cafe to grab some breakfast and try to process what had happened. I told a couple of the older villagers what we'd seen, and some of them nodded knowingly. One of them said something in Ukrainian that our translator later told us meant, "The river chooses who it shows itself to." You're lucky most people only see it once if they live to tell about it. To this day, I don't know if I'm lucky or cursed. I'm still trying to process the whole thing. When we reviewed our footage later, we found that all our cameras had mysteriously stopped recording several hours before the incident, only starting again after sunrise. I guess if there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that some waters run deeper than we think, and some legends exist for a reason. I won't forget that night anytime soon, and I definitely won't be doing any more midnight bathroom breaks by the river. We had just started dating, and this was our first camping trip together. I wanted to choose somewhere interesting, but not too remote. So I booked a spot at an old campsite near an abandoned sanatorium in the Tatra Mountains of Slovakia. The location had a fascinating history. It used to be a tuberculosis treatment center in the early 20th century before being converted into a mental health facility, then finally abandoned in the 1980s. We arrived late afternoon and immediately noticed the atmosphere was different from typical campsites. The grounds were well maintained enough, but you could see the looming structure of the old sanatorium through the trees. All Art Deco angles and broken windows. Not wanting to spook my girlfriend, I didn't mention the building's history, though I'd read about it extensively online. While we were setting up our tent and organizing our gear, a man pulled up alone at the spot closest to ours and started setting up his camp. He came over and asked to borrow our mallet for his tent stakes. Something seemed off about him from the start. He was wearing what looked like old-fashioned hospital pajamas under his coat, but I figured maybe they were just comfortable camping clothes. He was quiet but polite enough, so we told him he could join us for a drink later if he wanted. When he came back to return the mallet, he stayed for that drink but barely spoke, even when we tried to include him in the conversation. He seemed content just observing us, his eyes constantly darting between us and the old building in the distance. Some time passed, and I did the usual getting pretty tired routine. Nothing. Finally, my girlfriend just said goodnight and went to bed. The man and I sat there for a bit until I just stood up and said, "I'm heading to bed." He said goodnight and left. Then things got weird. He went to his car and just sat there, engine running. Maybe this isn't strange because he never made a fire, but it wasn't that cold, and he just kept sitting there for hours. I finally fell asleep, but woke up around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom. Sure enough, his car was still running, and through the moonlight, I could see him sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat, staring directly at the old sanatorium. Back to bed again, and I wake up with the sun to see his tent still there, but his car gone. Very strange. But what was even weirder, our car door was wide open. There was nothing missing, and we hadn't left any food in there, but something felt deeply wrong about the whole situation. Later that morning, we went to the campsite office to check out. The old caretaker was there, and I mentioned our strange neighbor from the night before. The caretaker's face went pale. He asked us to describe the man and what he was wearing. When I mentioned the pajama-like clothes, the caretaker sat down heavily in his chair. He explained that they'd been having similar reports for years. Always the same description: a quiet man in hospital clothes who appears at night, sits in his car for hours watching the old building, then vanishes. The truly unsettling part: the caretaker showed us a photograph from 1975, a group shot of patients outside the sanatorium. In the front row was our visitor from last night, looking exactly the same, wearing the same clothes. The caretaker told us the man in the photo had been a long-term patient who disappeared one night in 1978. They never found him, but every few years, campers report encounters with someone matching his description perfectly. My girlfriend and I convinced ourselves that we were spared from whatever this entity's true intentions might have been due to our kindness in sharing our equipment and offering him a drink. But we both know we'll never camp there again. The strangest part: when we got home and looked at the photos from our trip, we noticed something chilling. In every shot that captured our car in the background, you can just make out a figure sitting in the back seat, wearing what looks like hospital pajamas. But we know for certain the car was locked all evening until we found it open in the morning. Sometimes I still check the back seat before getting into my car, especially at night. Some encounters leave marks on your psyche that never quite fade. When I was 16, my older sister convinced me to go camping with her near the ancient burial mounds in County Meath, Ireland. These prehistoric tombs, older than the pyramids, have always been part of local folklore, with stories about them being portals to the fairy world. My sister, studying archaeology at Trinity College, wanted to photograph the mounds at sunrise for her thesis project. We decided to pitch our small tent about 100 meters from the main burial mound. The local farmers had warned us not to camp too close to the ancient structures, something about respecting the old ways. My sister, being the practical academic type, dismissed their concerns as superstition, though she did agree to keep some distance out of respect for the archaeological site. We didn't even make it through one night. Every so often, we clearly heard sounds coming from beneath the ground, not animal sounds, but something else entirely. At first, it was like a low humming, almost musical, as if someone was singing in a language we couldn't understand. We were terrified because the sounds seemed to be getting closer, moving through the earth beneath our tent. I don't remember who started screaming first, but soon we were both calling for our parents like we were children again. My sister, usually the calm one, was white as a sheet. I guess our screaming brought the local farmer out to check on us. He took one look at our faces and knew exactly what had happened. "You've heard them singing, haven't you?" he asked, not really needing an answer. He explained that the sounds were well known to local families. They called them the old songs, and they usually occurred on certain nights of the year. We tried camping again, this time in his field about half a mile from the mounds. But after a while, the sounds started up again. They were fainter this time, but unmistakable. That same otherworldly singing, like voices from thousands of years ago reaching through the earth. Later investigation revealed something fascinating. My sister, still determined to complete her thesis, discovered that the burial mound contained a series of internal chambers and passages. On certain nights, when the wind blows just right, it creates strange acoustic effects in these ancient corridors. But here's the thing, we weren't there on one of those windy nights. The air was completely still when we heard the singing. The farmer's wife later told us that according to local legend, the mounds weren't just tombs. They were meeting places where the ancient Irish would gather to perform sacred ceremonies. Some say the songs we heard were echoes of these rituals, still repeating through time. My sister finished her thesis, but she never went back to photograph the mounds at sunrise. She said some things in archaeology are better left to time-lapse cameras and remote sensors. As for me, I still get goosebumps whenever I hear certain kinds of singing, especially when it's in a language I don't understand. A few years later, when they did some acoustic studies of the burial mound, they found that the internal chamber was designed to amplify and reflect sound in very specific ways. But they never could explain why those sounds only seemed to come alive on certain nights, or why they always seemed to carry words in a language no living person has ever heard. It's pretty funny now, but damn were we creeped out at the time. Sometimes the oldest places hold the strongest memories, and sometimes those memories have voices of their own. I'm 23, British, and in June 2023, my family and I went to the Norwegian fjords for a photography expedition. There were 4 of us in a rented camper van, visiting remote villages and natural wonders along the rugged coastline. About a week into the trip, we reached Jotunheimen National Park, a vast wilderness that the locals call home of the giants. Jotunheimen is breathtakingly beautiful and absolutely massive, encompassing countless peaks and valleys. We visited the information center and booked onto a guided nature walk for the next morning. The guide would take us deep into the park, where we might spot some of the rare Arctic wildlife. I'm an experienced traveler. I've photographed in the Alps, the Arctic Circle, and even the Sahara. I've seen my share of impressive landscapes, but nothing had prepared me for what happened that day. We got up early and joined our guide, setting off under the endless summer sunlight. The journey would take about 3 hours to reach a remote observation point. It was a stunning, clear day. The guide pointed out various landmarks, including ancient rock formations that featured in Norse mythology. We also spotted several reindeer mothers with their calves, and Arctic foxes darting between rocks. For British visitors like us, seeing such magnificent wildlife in their natural habitat was incredible. The thing that really took my breath away, though, wasn't the landscape. It was what happened next. The guide was telling us about local folklore when he suddenly fell silent, staring at something in the distance. Standing perfectly still on a rocky outcrop was the largest reindeer I'd ever seen. Its coat was unusually pale, almost white, and its antlers seemed to catch the endless sunlight in an unnatural way. The guide looked troubled. He explained that reindeer usually travel in herds, and males typically avoid humans. This one was behaving strangely. It stood watching us, completely motionless, for several minutes before disappearing behind some rocks. 2 days later, and 6 miles away, in a completely different direction that no animal could logically follow, I was setting up my camera equipment when I started hearing movement in the rocks above us. The footsteps were too deliberate for a normal animal. I called out, thinking it might be another hiker. From somewhere in the mist came the sound of hooves on stone, steady and rhythmic. Then through the fog I saw it, the same enormous white reindeer, still alone, still watching. Its eyes seemed to glow with an internal light, and its antlers cast impossible shadows in the midnight sun. The moment we made eye contact, it vanished into the mist. But this time, something made me follow. I tracked it for about 50 meters before common sense kicked in. Following a strange animal into the fog could be suicide. When I turned back, I realized with horror that I couldn't see our campsite anymore. I decided the trip was over. First thing in the morning, we began hiking back to civilization, constantly looking over our shoulders. I used every trick I knew about navigation, but couldn't shake the feeling we were being followed. That night, we heard what sounded like hooves circling our camper van. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there were strange marks in the mud, not quite reindeer tracks, but not quite something else either. The second night, the sounds changed. What started as distant hoof beats slowly transformed into something else. Something that sounded more like footsteps. Human footsteps. The local guides later told us about legends of the Huldrefolk, supernatural beings that could take the form of animals, particularly white reindeer, to observe humans who ventured too far into their territory. I never saw the white reindeer again, but those few days were the most terrifying of my life. The relief when we finally reached our car was overwhelming. I nearly cried from the release of tension. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered. The strangest part, when I developed my photographs, every image taken after our first encounter showed something unusual in the background. A pale shape, almost like a reindeer, but not quite, transforming into something more humanoid with each successive shot. The last photo in the series, taken just before we left, shows what looks like a tall, pale figure standing among the rocks, wearing what appears to be ancient Norse clothing, its head crowned with antlers. Local folklore experts later told me that in Norse mythology, some spirits could shift between animal and human form, often appearing as white reindeer to test travelers who entered their domain. They said we were lucky. Most people who attract their attention don't come back with just photographs. I've photographed wildlife in some of the most remote places on Earth, but nothing has ever matched the primal fear I felt in those mountains. Sometimes, when I look at those photos, I swear the figure in the background is in a slightly different position each time I view them. The experience taught me that some places still hold ancient powers, and sometimes the line between observer and observed isn't as clear as we think. I still photograph wildlife, but now I always ask permission out loud before entering any new territory. Some might call it superstition, but after what I saw in Jotunheimen, I'd rather be safe than sorry. I grew up in Sofia, Bulgaria, but for some reason, we generally went to the Rhodope Mountains for our summer camping trips. I was about 12 years old, early 2000s, and it was the night of Nestinari, the ancient fire-walking festival. I woke up in the middle of the night because our tent was getting uncomfortably hot. My younger brother was sleeping next to me, and I was planning to move to the car where it would be cooler. I climbed over my brother, waking him up in the process. Of course, he said he needed to come with me, which I suspected was probably because he always had to follow me wherever I went. We got out of the tent, and there was a strange orange glow in the sky. At first, I thought it was just the sunrise, but my brother, who was in the Young Scouts, pointed out that the light was coming from the wrong direction. I tried to argue with him. Being the older sibling meant I couldn't possibly be wrong, but this woke our parents. My father stuck his head out of the tent to quiet us down, and noticed the strange, swirling red glow as well. Only this wasn't sunrise at all. What we saw next was something none of us could explain. The orange glow wasn't just light, it was moving, almost dancing like a tornado made of fire. The local villagers had warned us about camping on this particular night, saying it was when the fire spirits were most active, but we dismissed it as folklore. We grabbed our essentials at lightning speed, didn't even take down the tent, just collapsed it and shoved everything into the back of our old Lada station wagon. My father drove as fast as he dared on the narrow, winding mountain roads. He kept telling us everything would be fine, but between the rapidly approaching fire tornado and the lack of guardrails between us and the deep valleys below, I was terrified. We hadn't been driving long when we saw a forest ranger's vehicle coming out of one of the side roads leading to another campground. He flashed his lights at us, and we stopped. The ranger spoke with my father briefly, his face illuminated by that otherworldly orange glow. He explained that this wasn't a normal fire. It was something the locals called the dance of the fire spirits, a rare phenomenon that occurred during the Nestinari festival. He told my father we had enough time to get out safely, but advised us not to panic. It didn't help much. We were still going at a considerable speed, and I didn't feel particularly relieved until we reached the main road. Every time I see videos of fire tornadoes now, I remember that night, and that tiny spot at the back of my brain starts screaming. Later, we learned that the phenomenon we witnessed was something the local people had known about for centuries. They say it's why the Nestinari firewalkers can dance on burning coals. They've learned to communicate with these fire spirits. The ranger we met that night was actually a former Nestinar dancer himself, which explained why he was so calm about the whole thing. When we returned to our campsite the next day, expecting to find everything burned, we were shocked. There was a perfect circle of scorched earth around where our tent had been, but nothing was actually burned. The locals just nodded knowingly when we told them. Apparently, the fire spirits rarely destroy things. They're more interested in reminding people of their presence. I still go camping in the Rhodope Mountains, but never during the Nestinari festival. Some forces of nature, I've learned, deserve their own space and time. I'd say the most life-threatening thing was becoming hypothermic in the middle of nowhere, unable to make a fire because my hands wouldn't work and everything was either soaked or frozen. But that's not the interesting part. The other experience that haunts me happened during a devastating storm in the Transylvanian mountains, the kind that the locals call Devil's Dance. For those unfamiliar with Transylvanian storms, imagine the sky turning into a writhing mass of darkness, with winds so powerful they can literally uproot ancient trees. I was camping during one of these storms, the one that tore through the Carpathian Range 2 years ago. For an experienced climber like myself, it might not have sounded that bad initially, but trust me, it was. Unfortunately, the storm wasn't even the scariest part of that night. Long story short, I'd set up my tent in a single-wall stone shepherd's hut, so I felt mostly protected from flying debris and falling trees. But unlucky for me, something else had apparently also decided to seek shelter in this very same hut. And whatever it was not happy about sharing the space. I've encountered plenty of wildlife in my years of climbing and camping, but this was different. As this clearly terrified and angry creature circled my tent, I could hear its claws clicking against the stone floor of the hut with each galloping stride. I heard the tap, 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 tap of its claws, accompanied by its intermittent huffs and growls of confusion and anger. Of course, this symphony of terror was nicely complemented by the sounds of gale-force winds tearing apart the forest around me. The locals later told me these storms often drive creatures out of the deep forest, not just normal animals, but other things too, things they don't like to name. To this day, it remains one of the only times I haven't been able to identify what kind of creature I was dealing with. Usually, I can recognize animal sounds and behaviors, but the storm had apparently riled this one up so much that there was no amount of shouts or threats that could convince it to leave the safety of the hut. It just continued running circles around my tent, frequently leaving the hut for a few seconds only to immediately return, just as angry as ever. I could only sit there, hoping to wait it out, opting to pass the time by duct taping my climbing knife to my hand should worst come to worst. The creature's movements were unlike anything I'd encountered. Sometimes it seemed to be walking on 2 legs, other times on 4. And occasionally, I could hear it climbing the walls of the hut with impossible speed. Its shadows, cast by my lantern against the tent walls, didn't match any animal I knew. They kept shifting, changing shape, as if the thing couldn't decide what form to take. The storm raged on for hours, and all that time, the thing kept circling, kept changing, kept making those terrible sounds that were almost words, but not quite. The locals have a name for creatures like this. They call them Skimbatori, the Changers. They say these beings get drawn to human shelters during storms, not because they want to hurt people, but because they're trying to remember what it was like to be human themselves. When dawn finally came and the storm subsided, I found strange markings all around my tent. Not quite animal tracks, not quite human footprints, but something in between. The stone floor was scratched with patterns that looked almost like ancient writing, but they faded away as the morning sun touched them. The shepherd who owned the hut later told me I was lucky. The creature could have tried to take my form instead of just circling my tent all night. He said during these storms, the barriers between our world and theirs become thin, and sometimes things come through that haven't been human for a very, very long time. I still climb in those mountains, but now I always check the weather forecasts for devil's dances. Some storms, I've learned, bring more than just wind and rain. I grew up in Krakow, but for some reason, we generally went to the High Tatras for our winter holidays. It was during the Christmas break in the early 1980s, and I remember it like it was yesterday. The mountains were different, then wilder, more mysterious. especially during the long winter nights. I was about 10 years old when my family decided to spend the time between Christmas and New Year in a remote mountain shelter. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, perfect for winter hiking and stargazing. What we experienced instead would change how I look at the winter sky forever. One evening, around midnight, I woke up to an unusual light filtering through our cabin's windows. At first, I thought it was just moonlight reflecting off the snow, but this was different. It moved like liquid fire across the sky, in colors I'd never seen before. My younger sister was already awake, pressing her face against the window in wonder. We'd never seen the northern lights this far south. It should have been impossible. The colors were wrong too. Instead of the usual greens and purples, these lights were deep red and golden, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like they were trying to form words or symbols. My parents woke up to our excited whispers. My father, who worked at the Astronomical Observatory in Krakow, immediately knew something was strange. "This isn't Aurora Borealis," he said, his voice tense. "This is something else." The lights began to intensify, casting strange shadows that moved against the natural fall of light. The snow outside seemed to glow from within, and the temperature in the cabin dropped dramatically, despite our roaring fireplace. My mother started packing our essential belongings, her instincts telling her something wasn't right. Then we heard it, a sound like singing, but not quite human, coming from somewhere in the swirling lights above. The local mountain rescue service later told us that other people in different shelters heard it too. A chorus of voices that seemed to be calling from the sky itself. My father made the decision quickly. "We need to get down the mountain," he said, throwing our warmest clothes at us. Now we'd never seen him so serious, so afraid. We packed up our car, a battered old Fiat, and started the treacherous descent down the mountain road. The lights followed us, not like normal aurora, which stays fixed in the sky, but like something conscious, something aware. They seemed to flow down the mountainside with us, casting those impossible shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. We hadn't been driving long when we saw a mountain rescue vehicle coming up the road. The rescue worker's face was pale as he told us to follow him. Other families were being evacuated too. Apparently, the phenomenon was affecting electronic equipment throughout the range, and they were worried about safety systems failing. As we descended, my sister noticed something extraordinary. Where the lights touched the snow, it left patterns like frost flowers, but they were forming impossible shapes, geometric patterns that my father said looked like ancient astronomical charts. The next morning, after we'd reached the safety of the valley, the news reported it as an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, possibly caused by solar flare activity. But the locals had a different explanation. The older residents spoke of the Christmas lights, a rare occurrence that happened every few generations when, they claimed, the star that guided the three kings passed close to Earth again. We later learned that similar phenomena had been reported in the Tatras throughout history, always during the 12 days of Christmas, always accompanied by those strange, singing voices. Some of the patterns left in the snow matched symbols found in medieval Polish astronomical texts, depicting things that shouldn't have been visible to astronomers of that era. My father spent years trying to explain what we saw scientifically, but he never could. The The patterns photographed in the snow defied natural formation processes, and the spectrographic analysis of the lights showed wavelengths that, according to his colleagues, shouldn't exist in our atmosphere. To this day, whenever I see normal aurora borealis, I remember that night and the way those other lights seemed to watch us, follow us, study us. Sometimes, on very clear winter nights in the mountains, I think I can still hear that distant, impossible singing. The old people in the Tatras say the lights appear to remind us that some mysteries aren't meant to be understood, only witnessed. Maybe they're right. Some phenomena exist in that strange space between science and legend, between the explicable and the divine. I'm a long-distance alpine hiker. I've completed the Tour du Mont Blanc twice in both directions, and have hiked many sections of the Alpine Path, as well as numerous random routes throughout the Alps. In my time outdoors, I have probably a year of collective experience sleeping in mountain huts, and have hiked over 2,000 miles collectively. In all those adventures, I've only managed to encounter 3 wild wolves, some chamois, and I've smelled a lynx nearby once. I've heard the infamous alpine stones falling in the night. I'm not a big believer in mountain spirits or old legends, but I have a story that makes me question everything I thought I knew. In 2022, I was hiking the Tour du Mont Blanc in the French Alps. It's a long-distance trail that spans 170 kilometers around Mont Blanc, passing through France, Italy, and Switzerland. The trail is remote and located in some of the most stunning, untouched alpine terrain Europe has to offer. I was hiking the traditional counterclockwise direction with my wife and a female friend. This story takes place during that trip, about halfway through our journey when the afternoon was getting ready to end. We decided to camp in a place called Valley of the Ghosts, named after the way mist forms into strange shapes in the evening. The previous year, I'd enjoyed fishing here, and the gentle river that curves back and forth through the meadows makes a nice place to swim and filter water. We started to make camp for the night when I noticed a large figure about 10 meters from us, just standing there, staring. It was an old man, dressed like a traditional alpine shepherd, complete with a wooden staff. He then started approaching, and I started to yell at him just to keep him away. He circled around us a bit, then left back down the way he came from. I decided I would catch a few fish before the sun went down, and maybe we would have some fresh trout for dinner. The girls agreed and said they would finish making camp. We split up as I went down toward the small river in the meadow. There was a large boulder near where we were camping. It was about the size of a 2-car garage, and about that tall as well, large enough you couldn't see over it. When I passed it, I noticed the old shepherd come walking around it in my direction. I was surprised because I'd seen him walk away in the opposite direction. He was not on any trail. He was just walking straight through the meadow with a river running through it, away from any path. As he got closer, I noticed he was wearing traditional alpine clothing, hand-woven wool jacket, leather shorts, and a felt hat with a feather, all completely clean and new-looking, which may not sound strange. But when you're multiple days away from any trailhead that leads out of the mountains, it sure is strange. I was kind of walking away from him toward the river, but it seemed like he was following me, so I stopped and said, "Bonjour, monsieur. Comment allez-vous?" He replied with hello, in a very plain, monotone voice. He then asked me in the same voice, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm going fishing," I laughed, as if it wasn't obvious. I had a rod and reel in my hand. He didn't laugh. He just stared and said, "What will you do with the fish?" "If it's big enough and not spawning, I'm going to eat it," I said. At this point, I'd stopped by a little beach on the side of the river, and he passed by me. I felt relief, but then, just when he was about 20 feet past me, he stopped and turned around along the beach and squatted down and watched me fish. Eventually, I pulled one in, and it was a good size. As I pulled the guts out of the fish, he said, "How does it taste?" And I looked over at him waiting to hear a joke or something, and he was smiling. A terrible feeling came over me, like that hair-on-your-neck type of feeling. I said, "Well, I have to clean it first, man." He just kept smiling that unsettling smile. After a while, he stood up and walked off into the meadow toward a tree line, not on or near any trail, and vanished into the woods. I went back to camp and didn't really say anything to the girls because I didn't want to scare them. The night came in, we ate, and went to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I felt like something woke me up. I noticed both girls sitting up, and my wife said, "There is something there." I was so tired, I just said, "No, there isn't. Go to bed, guys." I laid down, and so did the girls, and within seconds, we heard a very fast shuffling sound. I sat up, and so did the girls. I said, "Oh yeah, there's definitely something there." I use a small foam sitting mat outside my inner tent in the vestibule for shoes at night and to sit on during the day, and I saw it moving. Something was literally right outside the tent. I grabbed my headlamp and our hiking poles, and with my heart exploding out of my chest, I unzipped the tent ready to battle whatever was there. There was nothing, not even a distant sound. It was dead silent, like ear-ringing silent, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. "Maybe it was a marmot or something," I said. We laid down, and this ended up happening like 7 more times. Every time, nothing there. Eventually, I started to actually pass out because of how exhausted I was, and I only remember cursing at it as I went to sleep. I woke up again and looked over. Both my wife and our friend were asleep. I heard the sound again, and I got the hiking poles and got myself ready. I unzipped the tent, and there he was, about 5 meters away. The same shepherd, on all fours in an almost push-up-like position, staring directly at me with that same smile. It was completely silent. Then he crawled backward into the dark with a speed I can't explain. I woke up. I was so relieved it was a dream. In the morning, I told them I dreamed there was something at the tent, and they looked at me like I was joking. Our friend said, "Yeah, there was something there you don't remember." My heart sank. "What about that shepherd?" I asked. "What shepherd?" they replied. They only remembered seeing that shepherd down with me by the river, so he was real. But they also recalled not understanding why they fell asleep so fast when something was outside, and that they felt like there was a blank in their memory before going to sleep. We all agreed that there was a general feeling that was just off in that place. I don't really tell this story because it sounds fake and stupid to me when I say it to myself, but it is real. I've heard later from local guides that the Valley of the Ghosts got its name not just from the mist. There are stories of an old shepherd who died there in the 19th century, still watching over his grazing grounds. I will never sleep in that valley again. I'm an experienced alpine hiker, but something about that place and that shepherd made me question everything I thought I knew about the mountains. This happened to me 30 years ago, but I remember the feeling of fear as if it were yesterday. I was photographing winter landscapes in the Julian Alps of Slovenia with two friends. We'd heard about an old mountain shelter, originally built in the 1800s as a smuggler's hideout before becoming a refuge during both world wars. Now it served as a basic shelter for mountaineers and photographers like us. For those unfamiliar with mountain shelters in Slovenia, they're essentially basic structures in the middle of nowhere, often former farmhouses or military outposts converted into emergency accommodation. This particular shelter was special locals called it the Whispering House, because of the way the wind seemed to create voices as it passed through the old wooden beams. When we arrived, the shelter looked exactly like something from an old postcard. 2 stories of weathered stone and dark wood, with snow-laden eaves and windows that seemed to watch us approach. We needed to stay the night to capture the sunrise over the valley, and this was the only shelter for miles. The moment we stepped inside, something felt different. Not threatening exactly, but aware like the building itself knew we were there. The main room had a large fireplace, some basic furniture, and walls covered in old photographs of mountaineers and soldiers who'd stayed there over the decades. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't from a noise or anything specific at first, but I felt uncomfortably cold despite my sleeping bag. Then I heard something. The front door of the shelter creaked open slowly, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone walking around the main room in old military boots. I froze. My mind started racing, trying to figure out if it was one of us, if someone had gotten up in the middle of the night. But I could see both my friends still in their sleeping bags. The footsteps continued for a minute or two, slow and steady. And then there was the unmistakable sound of the door closing. After that, silence. Complete, utter silence. By this point, we were all awake and fully alert. It was pure instinct. We all felt the same way. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't imagine anyone walking all that way in the middle of a winter night. Yet it felt like someone was in the house with us. We couldn't ignore it. We decided to check things out together. We tiptoed downstairs, not saying a word to each other. Everyone felt that strange tension in the air, but no one wanted to voice it. The way the footsteps had been loud enough to wake us, but then stopped so abruptly, it wasn't natural. We opened the front door and stepped outside into the pitch-black night. There was nothing, no headlamps from anyone nearby, no sound of footsteps in the snow, not even an animal track. The fresh snow around the shelter was completely undisturbed, except for our own tracks from earlier. We thought maybe there was someone else staying in the shelter we hadn't noticed, but it was a small building. There was nowhere to hide. We stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. There were no signs of any other presence, no evidence of anyone else being there. After a few minutes of standing in the freezing darkness, we went back inside. The whole thing felt wrong, but we tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind or some strange noise from the building settling. But when we returned to the main room, something had changed. The old photographs on the walls were arranged differently. The next morning, while packing up, we found out that this shelter was apparently well known for strange occurrences. A local mountain guide later told us that many people who'd stayed there reported hearing footsteps when no one was around, or feeling like they were being watched. The most unsettling part: when we developed our photographs from that night, we found something strange in several of them. In the background of our evening shots, there were clear figures in old military uniforms standing by the windows, figures that weren't there when we took the pictures. We later learned that during World War II, a group of resistance fighters had used the shelter as a hideout. One winter night, they were discovered. Rather than surrender, they disappeared into the mountain storm. Their bodies were never found, but ever since then, people have reported similar experiences: footsteps in the night, rearranged photographs, and mysterious figures in winter uniforms. When I look at those photographs now, I still get chills. Whatever stayed in that shelter with us that night, I don't think it meant us harm. It felt more like it was standing guard, still protecting its post after all these years. They say in Slovenia that some places hold memories so strong they become something more. That shelter taught me that sometimes the line between history and the present is thinner than we think, especially in places where people once fought and died for what they believed in. In the outskirts of Boston, where modern suburbia fades into historical remnants, stands the Ravenwood Estate, a magnificent Victorian mansion that seems to reject its owners like a body fighting infection. Every few months, a new family would move in, drawn by its Gothic charm and surprisingly reasonable price, only to flee within weeks, leaving behind half-unpacked boxes and countless questions. My friend Alex and I had watched this cycle repeat itself throughout our teenage years. We'd seen young couples, growing families, even a tech millionaire try to make it their home. None lasted more than 2 months. The longest residents were the real estate agents. For sale signs that seemed to have taken permanent residence in the overgrown front yard. That autumn evening, armed with recently acquired burgers and fries from the local diner, we decided to investigate what kept driving people away. The crisp October air carried whispers of approaching winter, and the setting sun painted long shadows across the mansion's weathered facade. We knew the local legends, of course. Everyone did. The tragic tale of the original owners, the Ashworth family, who disappeared one stormy night in 1893. Some said they were murdered. Others claimed they fled from something unspeakable. The truth had long since dissolved into myth, leaving only the house's imposing silhouette as a testament to its dark history. The back door's lock proved no match for Alex's surprisingly skilled hands. The hinges protested with a sound like distant screaming as we stepped into what was once a grand kitchen. Despite its abandonment, the mansion retained an air of faded elegance. Ornate woodwork adorned every doorway, and built-in cabinets lined the walls, their glass panes reflecting our flashlight beams like watching eyes. The layout reminded me of those historic house museums, complete with servant quarters and hidden passages. But unlike those well-preserved treasures, this place felt alive with decay. We moved through room after room, our footsteps echoing on hardwood floors. Nothing seemed particularly sinister, just the expected debris of hasty departures and years of neglect. Somewhat disappointed by the lack of supernatural activity, we settled in what must have been the formal dining room. A massive crystal chandelier hung above, its crystals thick with cobwebs, but still catching what little light filtered through the grimy windows. Across from us stood an alcove with a built-in bench, its velvet cushions long since destroyed by time and elements. We had been there maybe 20 minutes, finishing our now-cold burgers and sharing stories about the house's previous occupants, when everything changed. The shift was instantaneous and absolute. One moment, I was listening to Alex's theory about hidden treasure, and the next, I was drowning in darkness. This wasn't normal darkness. This was a living thing, pressing against my eyes, filling my lungs with ice. The cold that swept over me wasn't the gentle chill of autumn nights. It was the bone-deep freeze of a January midnight, the kind that makes your marrow ache. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think properly. Then Alex screamed, a sound of pure terror that seemed to come from miles away. I tried to reach out, to find anything familiar in this suffocating blackness. The air felt thick, like trying to move through frozen honey. My skin crawled with the sensation of something just beyond touch, something watching, waiting. Suddenly, Alex's hand grabbed mine. He pulled with such force, I thought my shoulder would dislocate. We stumbled through the house, me completely blind, him leading us toward what I hoped was the exit. I kept tripping, my feet refusing to cooperate, my mind unable to process the absolute darkness that had swallowed me. When we finally burst through the back door, a violent shiver raced through my entire body, starting at my toes and shooting up to my scalp. It felt like something was being peeled away from me, like shedding a second skin I hadn't known I was wearing. My vision returned in a flash of twilight colors. I turned to Alex. He stood there, pale as morning frost, staring at me like I had transformed into something monstrous. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a whisper. I couldn't see. It was like being buried in darkness. Alex didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled me into a fierce hug, his whole body trembling. When he finally spoke, his words turned my blood to ice. A woman in white appeared behind the bench. She wasn't right. She was like smoke but darker, and I could see right through her. She reached for you and he stopped, swallowing hard. She wrapped herself around you. That's why I screamed. We left quickly after that, our remaining food forgotten in that haunted dining room. Later, we learned that the Ashworth family's mother had disappeared first, followed by the rest of the family weeks later. They say she was last seen wearing her favorite white dress, standing in the dining room alcove, staring out the window as if waiting for something. The mansion still stands there today, its windows dark eyes watching the neighborhood grow and change around it. Sometimes on quiet nights, locals swear they can see a figure in white moving past the dining room windows, still waiting, still searching. But neither Alex nor I ever went back to confirm these stories. Some doors once opened are better left closed forever. At 15, I found myself living in Pinewood, North Dakota, a dying town where abandoned buildings outnumbered the inhabited ones. The place had a constant undercurrent of despair, shuttered storefronts, boarded up houses, and a persistent whisper of criminal activity. Drug deals, missing persons reports, and petty theft had become so common they barely raised eyebrows anymore. My closest friends were the Williams brothers, Thomas and Michael, who lived nearby. We spent our days doing what bored teenagers do, riding bikes, shooting at cans with slingshots, and sneaking cigarettes behind old sheds. Most of it was harmless enough, until that summer afternoon when curiosity led us down a darker path. We were deep in the back country, pedaling through overgrown fields where the grass grew tall enough to hide a standing man. The cicadas screamed their endless summer song, so loud it felt like they were trying to warn us away. That's when we found it, the old Peterson farm, half swallowed by nature's relentless advance. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking. The wooden siding had aged to the color of cemetery stones, warped and peeling like dead skin. Thick ivy choked the walls, and an ancient pickup truck, probably a 1950s International Harvester, was slowly dissolving into the earth. Its tires had long since rotted away, and its windows were so thick with grime and pollen they looked like cataracts in dead eyes. The front door wouldn't budge, but Thomas gave me a boost through a broken bathroom window. The jagged glass still clung to the frame like broken teeth, and I carefully maneuvered through to let the others in through the front. The door's hinges screamed like a wounded animal, the sound echoing through the empty house. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of wet earth, animal waste, and something sickeningly sweet that caught in the back of your throat. The floorboards were soft in places, threatening to give way with each step. What struck us most was how the place seemed frozen in time, personal belongings scattered everywhere, as if the family had vanished mid-routine. Plates still sat on the kitchen table. A coat hung limply over a chair, everything buried under years of undisturbed dust. Room by room, we explored this tomb of memories. In what must have been the master bedroom, we found something that made my blood run cold. A pair of police handcuffs attached to an old radiator. The metal was stained and twisted, as if someone had fought desperately to break free. The wall behind it bore deep gouges, like someone had clawed at it with their bare hands until their fingers bled. The children's bedroom was even worse. Family photographs lay scattered across the floor. A stern-looking man in work clothes, a tired woman, and a small boy with a missing front tooth, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Some photos were torn. Others looked like they'd been stepped on repeatedly. The room itself was a time capsule toy trucks still parked on the floor, a faded blue blanket on the bed, and a mobile hanging motionless above it. Despite the summer heat outside, this room felt ice cold. We tried to access the attic, but the stairs had collapsed. Using broken chairs and cinder blocks, we built a makeshift platform. I climbed up first, my heart pounding with each creak of wood. The attic was an oven, but something had clearly been living there recently. A filthy sleeping bag lay in one corner, surrounded by food wrappers and empty bottles. Military dog tags hung from a nail in the rafters, and a belt tied in a loop lay next to a blackened spoon. Whoever had been squatting here had left in a hurry. Then came the worst part. Stepping back outside, I suddenly disappeared. The ground simply opened up beneath me. I had fallen through a hidden cellar entrance. concealed under a sheet of rusted metal and dead leaves. The fall wasn't far, but I landed hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs. In the pitch darkness, my hand touched something soft fabric. When Thomas shone his flashlight down, I saw them small bones scattered across the dirt floor, tangled in what was unmistakably a child's pajamas. The pattern was faded, but still visible little rockets and stars. I told myself they were animal bones, but deep down I knew better. I clawed my way out of that pit like something was chasing me, though nothing was, at least, nothing I could see. The sun was setting when we left, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us like grasping fingers. We rode home in complete silence, no jokes, no laughter, nothing. Years later, I still think about that place, about the handcuffs, the child's room, the squatter in the attic, and those small bones buried in darkness. I don't need ghosts or monsters to make that memory terrifying. Sometimes the worst horrors are the ones humans create, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions, graves without names, and stories too terrible to tell. The old Peterson farm still stands there, slowly sinking into the earth, taking its secrets with it. Sometimes I wonder if those bones are still there, buried in the dark, waiting for someone to finally tell their story. But I won't be the one to go back and check. Some mysteries are better left buried, some doors better left closed, and some stories better left untold. Late spring of 2019 marked my most disturbing urban exploration yet. I'm no newcomer to this. I've documented decaying asylums, crawled through collapsed subway tunnels, and photographed the hollow shells of abandoned theaters. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what we discovered in the mountains of Vermont. The Redwood Sanatorium wasn't well known then. No carefully crafted Instagram posts, no YouTube urban exploration videos, no online guides marking its location. It was just a massive structure of weathered brick and broken dreams, perched on a remote hillside like a forgotten sentinel. David spotted it while working on a photography assignment in the area. A sprawling complex of Victorian architecture slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The first time we drove up the overgrown access road, the place felt somehow removed from time. The main building rose 4 stories high, its wings spreading out like dark arms waiting to embrace unwary visitors. Smaller outbuildings dotted the property, each in various states of decay. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating patterns that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. David was hesitant. He always was about these things. But I was vibrating with excitement, eager to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden behind those crumbling walls. The main entrance was blocked by fallen debris, so we started with what appeared to be a former storage facility. We climbed through a warped wooden door, hanging precariously from its hinges. The upper floor was relatively mundane, rusted equipment, rotting furniture, broken windows, letting in streams of dust-filled light. But when we ventured into the lower level, everything changed. The basement was vast, damp, and wrapped in shadow. The concrete walls were covered in disturbing symbols drawn in deep red and black paint, or at least, we hoped it was paint. Elaborate circular patterns, ancient-looking runes, and phrases written in languages I didn't recognize spiraled across every surface. In the center of the room stood what could only be described as an altar, a massive stone slab surrounded by dozens of black candles. Their wax formed stalactites that dripped down to the floor. Next to it lay various ritual implements, ornate daggers with blackened blades, bottles containing dark substances, and what appeared to be animal bones arranged in specific patterns. But the most horrifying discovery was in the adjacent silo. The cylindrical structure had been converted into some kind of holding cell. Heavy metal bars had been welded across the opening, and thick chains were bolted into the concrete walls. Deep scratches marked the inside of the walls, some so deep they must have torn through flesh to make. David wanted to leave immediately, but I convinced myself it was just elaborate props left behind by some gothic metal band or horror movie production. The stable was next, tucked away behind the main building and half sunken into the hillside. The moment I pushed open the door, the smell hit me like a physical force: decay, death, and something even worse. Inside, we found dozens of animal carcasses in various states of decomposition: cats, dogs, deer, even what looked like a black bear. Some had been methodically dissected, others arranged in unnatural positions, all part of some terrible ceremony. David had finally had enough. "We're leaving." Now, this time, I didn't argue. But as we made our way back up the path, I noticed the carriage house, a squat brick building almost completely covered in ivy. David stormed ahead, assuming I was behind him, but I couldn't resist one last look. The building was empty save for some old gardening tools and rotting burlap sacks. That detour saved our lives. When I stepped back outside, I froze. A man was bent over our car, rummaging through the glove compartment. A baseball bat leaned against his leg. He wasn't alone. Emerging from the woods came a group of about 12 people. Men and women of various ages, even a few teenagers. Each one carried some kind of weapon: bats, poles, chains, even garden tools. They moved with an eerie synchronization, like they'd been waiting for us. I screamed a warning to David, who came running back, his face pale but determined. The group scattered slightly at our confrontation, some trying to hide their weapons behind their backs, as if we hadn't already seen them. "Who are you?" the man at our car demanded, his voice unnaturally calm. David, thinking quickly, lied. "We're architectural photographers doing a piece on historic sanatoriums. Our editor knows exactly where we are." The group exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, they stepped back, allowing us access to our car. We got in, locked the doors, and drove away as calmly as we could manage. But they followed. A black pickup truck with no license plates stayed behind us for nearly 40 minutes, only breaking off when we approached the main highway. We drove straight to the state police and filed a report. The officers exchanged meaningful looks, but wouldn't elaborate on what they knew about the place. David never went back to finish his photography assignment. Months later, my cousin, also an urban explorer, sent me coordinates for a cool abandoned place she wanted to check out. Of course, it was the Redwood Sanatorium. We're planning to return, but this time we'll be better prepared. I've been researching the history of the place, collecting local stories, and mapping all possible escape routes. To any urban explorers out there, always carry protection, tell multiple people where you're going, and trust your instincts. Not every abandoned building is truly abandoned, and sometimes the real dangers aren't the ghosts or collapsing floors. They're the living people who have made these forgotten places their own twisted sanctuaries. Hidden deep in the forests of New England stands St. Michael's Monastery, a forgotten relic of centuries past. Most locals pretend it doesn't exist, and those who know of it speak in whispers. No road leads directly to it anymore, just overgrown paths through dense woods where ancient oaks block out the sun. The building shouldn't still be standing, its stone walls crumbling, its bell tower listing slightly to one side like a drunk trying to keep his balance. The stories about St. Michael's vary, but they all circle back to Brother Magnus, a monk who vanished in 1872 while exploring the monastery's extensive underground tunnels. Some say he discovered something in those depths that drove him mad. Others claim he still walks the subterranean passages, his phantom footsteps echoing through the darkness. His body was never found. My friends and I, Kevin, Lisa, and Mark, had spent countless hours filming abandoned places for our social media channels. This was supposed to be another adventure, another chance to get some creepy footage. But something about that monastery felt wrong before we even stepped inside. The entrance to the underground tunnels had already been broken open when we arrived. The heavy wooden door lay splintered on the ground, its iron hinges twisted as if something had torn it free with inhuman strength. The marks looked fresh. We debated turning back, but I convinced the others to continue. After some research online, I'd found scattered mentions of the walking monk, Brother Magnus's spirit, reportedly seen wandering the tunnels with a lantern that gave off no light. Local legend said he was still searching for something he'd lost in the darkness. Armed with high-powered flashlights, extra batteries, two-way radios, and Lisa's rosary beads, she insisted. We descended the worn stone steps that spiraled into the earth. The moment we passed the threshold, everything felt heavier. Not darker, not colder, just wrong. Like we'd stepped into a place where the normal rules of reality had begun to fray. The tunnel was narrow and damp, clearly built for smaller, more ascetic men than us. Our footsteps, no matter how carefully placed, echoed strangely off the stone walls. The silence between those echoes was absolute. No dripping water, no distant sounds, not even the usual settling of an old building. At the base of the stairs, the passage turned sharply to the right. Our flashlight beams couldn't penetrate the darkness beyond the bend. Kevin, always prepared, lit a red emergency flare and tossed it around the corner. The sulphurous light revealed a chamber that must have once been a storage room, or perhaps a wine cellar. Rusted metal shelves lined the walls, and broken bottles crunched beneath our feet. Then we saw the blood, fresh crimson smears across the floor, leading to a darker passage at the far end. The doorway opened onto a smaller tunnel, and in the floor was a heavy iron grate with a rusted ladder descending into blackness. Someone had cut through the thick chain that once secured it. The three of us climbed down, with Mark, the heaviest, going last. Halfway down, the ancient metal gave way with a sound like a dying scream. The ladder collapsed, and Mark plummeted to the floor below with a sickening crunch. His agonized cry echoed through the tunnels. This new level was different. The air here tasted metallic, and the walls bore strange markings, not graffiti, but what looked like prayers carved into the stone itself by desperate hands. We had to carry Mark, both ankles shattered, whimpering in pain. With no way back up the broken ladder, we were forced to push forward. We passed dead rats and the bones of larger animals. Lisa kept whispering prayers, her rosary beads clicking softly. At one point, we had to step around a pile of old sandals, the kind monks would have worn centuries ago. We'd only been underground for maybe 10 minutes, but time felt wrong, stretched, and distorted like a reflection in troubled water. The passage ended at another, rusted ladder leading up. I went first, each rung groaning under my weight. The hatch above opened into what must have been the monastery's old kitchen. Wooden shelves lined the walls, their contents long rotted away, and cobwebs hung in thick curtains from the ceiling. That's when I saw him, slumped in the corner behind a pile of broken furniture, was a man in a brown robe. He was curled into himself, knees drawn up, arms wrapped tightly around them. One hand lay slack, fingers curved as if still holding something. His skin had a gray-green cast, and his eyes were open but saw nothing, fixed on some distant horror that had followed him into death. I backed down the ladder and told the others. No one asked if he was dead. We could feel it, like his death had left a stain in the air itself. Lisa was already pale, clutching her rosary so tight her knuckles were white. Mark had gone quiet, shock and pain glazing his eyes. We managed to get Mark up through the hatch. It took all 3 of us, and I still don't know how we did it. We found a door leading outside, half hidden behind a cascade of ivy, and didn't stop moving until we reached the car. The walk back seemed to take hours, with Mark leaning heavily on Kevin and me, each step punctuated by his pained gasps. At the hospital, we told them Mark had fallen while hiking. The nurse barely reacted, but something in her eyes suggested she knew we were lying. Later, we learned that 3 other people had been brought in with similar injuries over the past year, all claiming to have had hiking accidents in the same area. We never reported finding the body. How could we? We'd been trespassing, breaking into a historical site. But I still think about him, the way he died alone in the dark, curled up like he was hiding from something. What was he looking at in those final moments? What had he found in those tunnels that was worse than dying alone in the dark? St. Michael's Monastery still stands, its secret safe behind crumbling walls. Sometimes I wonder if that body is still there, or if whatever walks those tunnels has dragged it deeper into the darkness. Some say you can still hear footsteps echoing through the underground passages at night. But whether they belong to Brother Magnus or something else, I never want to find out. I'm not someone who spooks easily. 15 years working around hydroelectric systems has taught me to fear electrical failures and mechanical malfunctions more than any ghost story. I've crawled through cramped tunnels, descended into pitch-black intake chambers, and navigated maintenance shafts that haven't seen human presence in decades. But what happened at the old River Valley Power Station changed everything I thought I knew about rational fears. It started with a routine problem. Our monthly power generation reports showed significant discrepancies. We were losing almost 15% of expected output, nearly double the usual inefficiency rate. Either we had a major mechanical failure somewhere in the system, or someone was illegally tapping into the grid. Both scenarios needed immediate investigation. The department organized a systematic inspection of all facilities in our jurisdiction. My sector included the abandoned River Valley Station, a massive concrete and steel monument to 1920s industrial architecture. The facility hadn't been operational since 1987, when they built the modern complex downstream. It just sat there, slowly decaying, its massive turbine halls silent and dark. I went with Mike Donovan, who'd been around long enough to remember when River Valley was still running. The place looked more like a cathedral than a power plant, soaring ceilings, enormous arched windows, and intricate brickwork that you just don't see anymore. Ivy had claimed most of the exterior walls, and one of the massive steel doors hung askew, creaking softly in the autumn wind. Inside, it felt like stepping into a different century. Wide concrete walkways suspended over vast turbine pits, their depths lost in shadow. These chambers had once housed massive generators, but now they were filled with stagnant black water, its surface so still it looked solid. You couldn't see more than an inch below the surface, and the smell was overwhelming: wet metal, mold, and something else I couldn't quite identify. We walked carefully, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. Everything was eerily quiet, no dripping water, no echoes, no signs of the pigeons that usually inhabit these old buildings. I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At the far end of the main hall, a rusted spiral staircase led down to the control room. Mike mentioned something about checking the old isolation switches, though we both knew it was unnecessary. Nothing here had been powered in over 30 years. The steps groaned under our weight as we descended. The control room was like a museum of obsolete technology. Dust-covered panels lined the walls, their gauges frozen at their last reading. Ancient chairs sat empty before banks of switches and dials. Papers littered the floor, their text faded to illegibility. The far wall housed a line of tall metal lockers, their doors hanging open to reveal empty interiors. That's when we heard it, a high-pitched giggle, clear as day. Not an echo, not a bird, not any sound that belonged in this place. It was the laugh of a young girl, but wrong somehow too sharp, too cold. It cut through the stale air like a knife, bouncing off the concrete walls and setting my teeth on edge. Mike froze mid-step. "Did you?" he started, but I was already moving toward the sound, my flashlight beam dancing across the shadows. Nothing, just shelves of old equipment and the heavy smell of mildew. "Maybe it was a bird," Mike suggested, his voice shaky. But we both knew better. No bird could make a sound like that. We stood in stunned silence, listening for anything else. But there was nothing, just the occasional creak of settling metal and the distant hum of water moving somewhere in the building's depths. We checked every room on that level, every closet, every corner. Not a soul, no footprints in the dust, nothing to suggest anyone had been there before us. But that laugh, it had been too perfect, too clear, like it came from someone standing right beside us. We left quickly after that, walking faster than necessary, but not quite running. Outside in the autumn sunlight, everything suddenly felt normal again: birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze. but neither of us spoke until we were back in the truck. "Ever hear anything like that before?" I asked. Mike just shook his head, his face still pale. Neither of us mentioned the incident in our reports. There was no power loss at River Valley. Everything was exactly as abandoned as it should have been. But here's the part that truly haunts me. Later, out of morbid curiosity, I did some research into the station's history. In 1926, the station manager's daughter drowned in one of the turbine pits. She was 7 years old, last seen playing hide and seek in the control room. They never recovered her body. The systems were too complex, the underwater machinery too dangerous to navigate. Some old-timers say that's why they really closed River Valley. Not because of the new facility downstream, but because workers kept hearing a little girl's laughter echoing through the turbine hall, always followed by the sound of running footsteps and a splash. I don't talk about what we heard that day. I'm an engineer. I deal in facts, figures, and measurable realities. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that laugh, about the way it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And I wonder if she's still there, playing her endless game of hide and seek in the dark halls of River Valley Station, waiting for someone to finally find her. In Pittsburgh's industrial district, I broke into what could only be described as a paranoid man's fortress. From the outside, it looked like just another abandoned steel mill. Weathered brick walls, broken windows, and rusting metal frameworks reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. But inside, the building had been transformed into something else entirely. Something that spoke of obsession and fear. The stories varied about its history. Some said it was owned by a former military engineer who'd gone off the deep end, convinced that the Cold War never really ended. Others claimed it belonged to a wealthy industrialist who'd lost his mind after his family disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Whatever the truth, someone had turned this place into a maze of paranoid engineering, a building designed to both protect and trap. I found my way in through a partially collapsed section of the roof, where acid rain had eaten through the metal sheeting, creating a jagged opening like a wound in the building's skin. The smell hit first, a nauseating cocktail of rust, stagnant water, and something metallic that caught in the back of your throat, making you taste pennies on your tongue. Inside was a graveyard of industry, merged with military-grade fortification. Every doorway had been modified with thick steel reinforcements, some with multiple locking mechanisms that looked like they belonged in a bank vault. Heavy metal bars, clearly salvaged from industrial equipment, had been welded across windows and potential access points. Some doors were barricaded from the inside, others from the outside, as if the builder couldn't decide whether he was trying to keep danger out or contain something worse within. The most unsettling feature was a network of narrow corridors hidden between the walls. These secret passages were built with remarkable precision. The walls composed of steel plates welded together every 6 inches, creating an almost impenetrable barrier. I discovered them purely by accident, noticing slight irregularities in the wall spacing that revealed concealed doors. The main factory floor had been transformed into a series of interconnected chambers, each one more secure than the last. A massive steel plate, probably weighing several tons, was suspended from the ceiling by a complex system of chains and pulleys. It could be dropped in seconds, sealing off the entire western section of the building. I tested the mechanism. It still worked perfectly, the chains moving with well-oiled efficiency. Spray painted across one concrete wall in massive red letters were the initials PW below them. Someone had scratched a series of numbers into the concrete coordinates, maybe, or some kind of code. The paint was faded, but the scratches looked almost fresh, as if someone had been maintaining them. The deeper I went, the more the building's true nature revealed itself. I found rooms filled with shortwave radio equipment, walls lined with maps covered in incomprehensible notations, and filing cabinets full of newspaper clippings about government conspiracies and unexplained disappearances. In one room, a wall-mounted display held an impressive collection of gas masks, their empty eye holes staring out like dead things. But the worst discovery came in the basement level. Hidden behind a false wall, I found a room that still haunts my dreams. It was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with walls of bare concrete. The floor was stained with dark patches that I didn't want to identify, and deep scratches marked the walls, not random vandalism, but deliberate tallies, hundreds of them, grouped in sets of 5. A heavy steel door sealed the room, with no handle on the inside. Just a small slot at the bottom, like you'd see in a prison cell. The room had been used recently. Empty food containers lay scattered in one corner, along with a worn blanket and a plastic bottle. Someone had been kept here, maybe multiple someones, and not too long ago. On the wall, scratched so deep it had gouged into the concrete, was a single sentence. They were right about everything. I didn't stay much longer after that. You can tell yourself you're just exploring, just documenting decay and abandonment. But some places feel wrong in a way that goes beyond mere emptiness. This building wasn't just abandoned. It was engineered for paranoia, built by someone who either knew too much or had lost touch with reality. Maybe both. The most disturbing part. As I was leaving, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the dust outside, and footprints that couldn't have been more than a day old. Someone was still using this place, still maintaining its secrets, still believing in whatever nightmare had inspired its creation. In all my years of urban exploration, I've never returned to a single location. But I find myself thinking about that building often, wondering about its secrets, about the person who built it, about what they were so afraid of, or what they were trying to contain. Sometimes I catch myself scanning news reports about missing persons in the Pittsburgh area, wondering if any of them found their way into that room with no handle, adding their own tallies to the walls. Because the truth is, sometimes the most frightening things aren't the ghosts or monsters we imagine in the dark. Sometimes they're the complex architectures of human fear, the elaborate fortresses we build to protect ourselves from threats that might be real after all. I was born in West Berlin in the early 80s, but this story belongs to my older brother Marcus, who grew up in a very different Germany. He was born in 1979, and by 1988, he was just a street-smart kid running through a city literally divided by concrete and ideology. Back then, East Berlin didn't feel like a city. It felt like the aftermath of something. Buildings still bore the scars of a war that had ended decades ago. Authority was more rumor than reality, and the black market thrived in the shadows of socialist control. The wall stood like a monster of concrete and barbed wire, but the real boundaries were the ones in people's minds. Kids had a strange kind of freedom back then. Parents were too busy navigating the complexities of a failing system to worry about where their children spent their afternoons. My brother and his friends, Stefan and Eric, took full advantage of this negligence. They played in places most adults wouldn't venture near in broad daylight. Bombed-out buildings that nobody had bothered to rebuild, empty apartment blocks with no electricity, and forgotten factories where rust ate away at abandoned machinery. Their playgrounds were urban wastelands where the line between exploration and danger blurred. No warning signs were needed because everyone already knew. These places belonged to shadows and secrets. Graffiti covered the walls, some political, some artistic, all illegal. The buildings themselves seemed to decay faster than nature should allow, as if the weight of history was physically crushing them. One day, they were messing around in an abandoned apartment complex near the wall. The building had probably been magnificent once, with high ceilings and ornate moldings, but now it was just another hollow shell. They were doing what bored kids do, throwing rocks through already broken windows, lighting paper on fire just to watch it curl into ash, playing their own version of hide and seek in the empty rooms. That's when Stefan spotted something. "Someone's watching us," he whispered, suddenly serious. At first, they didn't pay much attention. Strange people often lurked in these places. Homeless individuals, black market dealers, people trying to escape the ever-watching eyes of the state. You learned to ignore them, to pretend you hadn't seen anything worth reporting. But this man was different. He wasn't trying to hide. He stood openly in a shaft of dusty sunlight, completely still, like a statue someone had forgotten to remove when the building was abandoned. He was tall, dressed in clothes that immediately marked him as an outsider. His coat was clearly Western, expensive leather, perfectly maintained, probably Italian. On his feet were American sneakers, pristine white that seemed to glow against the grimy floor. The sight of such wealth in East Berlin was jarring enough, but it was his eyes that made my brother's blood run cold. They moved from child to child with calculated precision, like a predator assessing prey. The man didn't speak, didn't move, just watched with those empty eyes. Then, without warning, his face twisted into something that was trying to be a smile, but wasn't quite human. "Nice shoes," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I have more. Better ones. American. Come, I'll show you." That's all he said, but something in his voice made every child freeze. Even for kids used to the dangers of a divided city, something felt terribly wrong. The man turned slightly, and Marcus saw it. The outline of a pistol tucked into his waistband, barely concealed by his expensive coat. "Gun," Eric screamed, and the spell broke. They ran like they'd never run before, feet pounding against broken concrete, pushing each other through narrow gaps, leaping down crumbling stairs. Behind them, they heard the man shout something in a language that wasn't German, but he didn't chase them. They didn't go back to that building, not for a long time. At first, it was just another story, another close call in a city full of dangers. But weeks later, their neighborhood was suddenly crawling with police, real police. not just the regular patrols. Police tape appeared, adults whispered in corners, and children were suddenly kept close to home. It wasn't until years later, long after the wall had fallen, and the truth about many things had come to light, that Marcus learned what had happened. A child had been found dead in that same building, beaten beyond recognition. The official report claimed it was an accident, but everyone knew better. The case was never solved, like many others from that time. Marcus doesn't talk about it much. He says it's one of those memories that lives in the corner of his mind, a reminder of a time when danger wore expensive clothes and smiled with empty eyes. The truth is, he and his friends weren't lucky because they were brave. They were lucky because they ran, because their fear was stronger than their curiosity. That building still stands today, though it's been renovated into luxury apartments. Sometimes tourists take pictures of the preserved Soviet-era graffiti on its outer walls, not knowing that the real horror stories aren't about the wall or the regime, but about the monsters who used the chaos of those times to hunt the innocent. The Evergreen Haven retirement home stood like a decaying giant in our quiet Portland suburb, its Victorian architecture slowly rotting beneath layers of ivy and neglect. The three-story building had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its windows either boarded up or shattered, the once manicured grounds now a jungle of overgrown shrubs and twisted tree branches. Local teenagers had turned it into their ultimate hangout spot, each generation adding their own stories to its mythology. Some claimed to hear the ghostly voices of former residents. Others swore they'd seen strange lights moving through the upper floors at night. But none of these stories prepared us for what we encountered that rainy October evening. I'd passed by Evergreen Haven countless times, always wondering what secrets lay behind its weathered walls. The property had that particular kind of sadness unique to abandoned care homes. A sense of lives concluded, memories forgotten, and stories left untold. According to local history, the place had closed suddenly in 2010 after a series of mysterious deaths and allegations of neglect. That night, Lucy, Ryan, and I decided to finally explore it for ourselves. The rain had just started, a fine mist that made everything look slightly surreal in the gathering darkness. The front door was locked, as always, but we'd heard about a broken window on the east side that offered easy access. The window led us into what must have been a recreation room. Moldy playing cards were scattered across water-damaged tables, and a television set hung crookedly from one wall, its screen long since shattered. The air inside was thick with the smell of rot and dampness, that particular musty odor that seems to collect in abandoned buildings like invisible dust. We moved through the ground floor, our flashlight beams dancing across peeling wallpaper and abandoned furniture. Everything felt frozen in Time magazines from 2009 still lay open on coffee tables. A half-finished puzzle permanently incomplete. Somebody's reading glasses left behind on an armchair, as if their owner had just stepped out for a moment. The silence was absolute, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional creak of settling wood. We were about to head upstairs when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of movement from somewhere above us. Not the random noises of an old building, but deliberate footsteps, slow and heavy. We froze, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving toward the staircase. Lucy whispered, "Probably just another explorer." But something in her voice suggested she didn't believe it. The steps grew closer, then suddenly quickened. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. A man, tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and dirty. He stood perfectly still for a moment, staring down at us with eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like a cat's. Then, without warning, he sprinted down the stairs with impossible speed. We ran. There was no discussion, no plan, pure instinct took over. We bolted for the nearest exit, but in our panic, we took a wrong turn. Instead of the recreation room with its broken window, we found ourselves in what had been the dining hall. Tables lay overturned, chairs scattered like abandoned sentries in the darkness. The man was right behind us, his breathing heavy and ragged. We could hear him muttering something, words too quiet to make out, but spoken with frightening intensity. Ryan stumbled over a fallen chair, and I heard him cry out in pain. Lucy and I turned back to help him up, and in that moment, our flashlights illuminated our pursuer's face. His eyes were wide and unfocused, his face covered in dirt and what looked horribly like dried blood. But what struck me most was his expression, not anger or malice, but a terrible kind of desperation, like a starving animal cornered by predators. We managed to get Ryan to his feet and found another exit, a service door that led to the kitchen. Through the kitchen we ran, past rusted ovens and molding cabinets, finally bursting out through a delivery entrance into the rain-soaked night. We didn't stop running until we reached Lucy's house, 4 blocks away. Once safe, we noticed Ryan's ankle was swollen. He'd twisted it badly when he fell. At the hospital, we told his parents he'd hurt himself playing basketball. The nurse gave us an odd look, but didn't ask questions. Later, we learned we weren't the first to end up in the ER, with injuries from Evergreen Haven. A week later, police cordoned off the property. Rumors spread through the neighborhood. They'd found evidence of someone living in the old building. Hidden food stashes, makeshift beds, even a crude alarm system made from string and tin cans. But the person themselves was never found. I still drive past Evergreen Haven sometimes. They've put up new fencing and warning signs, but teenagers still find their way in, looking for thrills or dares or Instagram photos. I want to tell them what we saw that night, about the man with desperate eyes who turned a place of death into his sanctuary. But I know they wouldn't listen. Every generation needs to learn for themselves that not all haunted places are haunted by ghosts. Sometimes, the living are far more terrifying than the dead. When I was 9, living on the outskirts of Taipei, I discovered what I now know was an abandoned Japanese military bunker from World War II. Though discovered might not be the right word. It was more like the bunker had been waiting for someone to find it, hidden beneath decades of tropical growth and forgotten memories. It was 1999, and my parents were environmental scientists studying Taiwan's coastal ecosystems. Our house sat near the edge of a dense forest that crept up the mountainside, where concrete remnants of the Japanese occupation still lingered like ancient ruins. I'd passed by the entrance countless times, a rust-covered metal gate, tightly sealed and almost consumed by the surrounding vegetation. It had that feeling about it, like the place itself wanted to remain hidden. But one day, something changed. The gate was open, not wide, just slightly ajar, as if someone had slipped inside and forgotten to close it properly. The surrounding debris had shifted too, revealing just enough space for a small child to squeeze through. Being a curious 9-year-old with more imagination than sense, I took this as an invitation. I had no flashlight, no phone, nothing but my pocket full of candy wrappers, and a spirit of adventure that would soon turn to terror. The entrance led to a narrow concrete stairwell that seemed to plunge straight into the earth. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It became heavy, metallic, carrying the strange smell of wet stone and forgotten things. Each step I took echoed too loudly, the sound bouncing back at me from unseen walls. The darkness grew thicker as I descended, but something kept pulling me forward, that childish certainty that something amazing waited just around the next corner. The further I went, the more it felt like I shouldn't be there, like I was being watched by something that wasn't human. Then my foot hit water. The step disappeared beneath the surface of what felt like liquid ice. I took another step, and the water rose to my calf. Another, and it reached my knees. I couldn't see it in the darkness, but I could feel it, black, still water that seemed to pull at my legs like hungry hands. That's when I felt something brush against my ankle. At first, I thought it was seaweed or debris, but then it happened again. Something smooth and cold slid across the top of my foot. Then another touch, more deliberate this time, like fingers exploring my skin. I couldn't see what it was, a fish, an eel, something worse. I was too paralyzed with fear to even look down. But something about that moment, the way the water seemed to move around me, like it had a mind of its own, triggered every survival instinct in my young body. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides, and the water. The water wasn't just moving, it was reaching for me. I turned and ran, or tried to. The water fought against me, slowing my movements like in a nightmare. My soaked shoes slipped on the concrete steps as I scrambled upward, practically crawling on all fours. The splashing echoed through the stairwell, impossibly loud, and I swear I heard something else moving in the water behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the bright sunshine, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. My clothes were soaking wet, my shoes ruined, and I smelled like stagnant water and decay. I told my parents I'd fallen into a stream while playing. They were too busy with their research to ask too many questions. For years, I convinced myself I'd imagined it all, that it was just rats or fish, that the water only seemed to move because I was scared. But I still remember how it felt when the water changed, how it wasn't still anymore once I stepped into it. It moved around me like a living thing, curious and hungry. The gate was never open again. I checked multiple times, always keeping my distance. Sometimes I'd stand there and listen, trying to hear anything from below, water moving, something breathing, any sign of what lived in those flooded tunnels. But there was never anything to hear, except the wind in the trees and the distant sound of waves. Years later, I learned that the bunker had been part of a larger underground complex, used by the Japanese military for purposes that never made it into official records. Local legends spoke of experiments conducted in those tunnels, of soldiers who went missing and were never found. Some said the complex extended far beneath the mountain, reaching into natural caverns that connected to the sea. I never went looking for that gate again. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Whatever lurks in those flooded tunnels, whether it's something natural that found its way in from the ocean or something else, something created by human hands in those dark years of war, it's better left undisturbed, waiting in the darkness beneath the mountain. A few miles down the rocky coast of Maine, where the Atlantic meets the shore in an eternal battle of waves and stone, stands the old Porter's Point Lighthouse. My dad bought a summer house nearby in the early 2000s, and that lighthouse became an obsession of mine. A ghost of a structure that seemed to reject the passage of time itself. The lighthouse keeper's quarters, a 3-story Victorian building attached to the tower, had been abandoned since 1972. The paint had long since surrendered to the salt air, leaving the wood beneath to weather to the color of old bones. What remained of the windows stared out at the ocean like blind eyes, some broken, others boarded up with splintering plywood that somehow never quite managed to keep determined teenagers out. Through the broken frame of what used to be a bay window, you could glimpse furniture draped in moldering sheets, frozen in time like a forgotten museum exhibit. An old Coast Guard truck, completely rusted out and half buried in beach grass, sat in the overgrown driveway like a mechanical tombstone. One weekend, my cousin Hannah came to stay. We were both around 12, bored and looking for adventure. The lighthouse had always given me the creeps, even in broad daylight, but Hannah was fearless. She suggested we bring our paintball guns, a new hobby we'd picked up that summer, and use the abandoned building for target practice. Standing in front of it that afternoon, the lighthouse felt different. The whole structure seemed to be watching us, the tower's lantern room like a disapproving eye. The windows were coated in decades of salt spray and grime, thick cobwebs stretching across broken panes like ancient lace. We started shooting, taking out every intact window we could find. The glass shattered satisfyingly, our fluorescent paintballs leaving bright splashes of color against the weathered wood. We laughed, competing to see who could make the most impressive pattern, feeling like rebels conquering an abandoned kingdom. Afterward, high on adrenaline and summer freedom, we went home to play video games and stuff ourselves with junk food like nothing had happened. But 2 weeks later, when Hannah visited again, we froze in our tracks at the sight of the lighthouse. The windows were back, not just repaired. They looked exactly as they had before, complete with the same layers of grime, the same cobwebs, the same clouded glass that had taken decades of coastal weather to create. Even the cracks in some panes were identical to what we remembered. "Didn't we?" Hannah started. "Yeah," I said. "We definitely did." We stood there, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Then, like a pair of idiots trying to prove we weren't going crazy, we shot out the windows again. Same targets, same breaking glass, same paint splatters. This time, though, it didn't feel like a game. It felt like we were challenging something. When we returned the next day, the windows were restored again. Perfect, untouched, as if we'd never been there at all. That's when we started asking questions. The old-timers at the general store were usually happy to share local history. But when we asked about the lighthouse, they got quiet. Finally, old Mr. Sullivan, who'd lived in the area his entire life, told us the story. The last lighthouse keeper, Harold Porter, had been obsessed with maintaining the building. Not just the light itself, which was his official duty, but every single detail of the structure. He would spend hours working on the windows, cleaning them meticulously, replacing any cracked panes immediately. Even during the worst storms, he would be out there, securing shutters and checking for damage. In 1972, Porter disappeared. No note, no body, nothing. The Coast Guard searched for weeks, but found no trace. The only odd detail was that every window in the building had been freshly cleaned the night he vanished, despite a raging storm that had battered the coast for days. Some locals claimed that on stormy nights, they could see a figure moving in the lighthouse windows, cloth in hand, endlessly cleaning the glass. Others said the building simply refused to show damage, as if Porter's dedication had somehow seeped into the very walls. Hannah and I never went back to test the windows again. Sometimes, walking along the beach, I'd look up at the lighthouse. The windows would stare back, pristine and eternal, keeping their secrets behind glass that refused to break. The paint continued to peel. The wood kept weathering, but those windows remained unchanged, as if someone or something was still there, maintaining them with otherworldly dedication. Years later, developers tried to renovate the building. They replaced all the windows with modern glass. Within a week, the new windows had vanished, replaced by the old clouded panes, complete with decades of accumulated grime. The developers gave up after 3 attempts, leaving the lighthouse to its ghostly keeper. Porter's Point Lighthouse still stands there today, its windows neither broken nor new, existing in a strange state of perpetual preservation. Sometimes, late at night, people say they can see reflections in those windows that don't match the world outside, as if they're showing scenes from another time, when a dedicated keeper still walked the halls, keeping his eternal watch over the building and the sea beyond. Back in the day, my friends and I treated ourselves to midnight adventures at the abandoned Ridgemont Veterans Psychiatric Center, perched on the misty peaks of North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains. Every urban explorer in 3 counties knew about it. A sprawling complex of Victorian-era buildings, their red brick walls streaked with age and neglect. Every window either boarded up or shattered, creating perfect frames for the darkness within. The only way inside was through a maintenance shed on the eastern wing, climb up, squeeze through a broken ventilation duct, and drop down into what used to be a storage room. We'd been in that place so many times that its endless corridors and peeling paint had become almost familiar. Almost. One night, driven by a mixture of boredom and that peculiar teenage belief in our own immortality, the 4 of us, myself, Casey, Matthew, and Olivia, decided to push our exploration further. We'd heard rumors about the basement level, a place perpetually flooded with dark water of unknown depth. Local legend claimed it housed the remnants of experimental treatment rooms, where returning soldiers from various wars had been subjected to questionable therapies. The basement was submerged in murky water, approximately 4 feet deep, concealing everything beneath its black surface. Down there, our flashlight beams revealed little more than vague shapes. What might have been examination tables, ancient file cabinets, and the ghostly outlines of doorways leading to God knows where. Armed with powerful flashlights, spare batteries, waterproof radios, and Casey's grandfather's old crucifix. He insisted. We made our way down a set of crumbling stairs. Each step groaned beneath our weight, the sound echoing through the flooded chambers below. The entrance to this underground level felt different from the rest of the building. The air was thick, almost reluctant to enter our lungs, and carried a metallic taste that clung to the back of our throats. The stairwell ended at the water's edge, an endless black pool that swallowed our light beams whole. Taking a collective breath, we began our descent into the water. It was freezing cold, the kind of cold that seeps straight into your bones and makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. The silence was absolute. No dripping water, no distant sounds, not even the usual settling of an old building. Our flashlight beams danced across the surface, creating strange patterns that seemed to move of their own accord. Then one of us, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, took the first step into the deeper water. The moment we moved beyond the stairwell, a massive splash erupted somewhere in the darkness. Not the gentle sound of disturbed water, but something like a cannonball hitting a pool. The sound reverberated through the flooded corridors, like a drumbeat from hell. Panic seized us, but before we could retreat, I distinctly heard something moving through the water toward us. It wasn't the random splashing of shifting debris. This was deliberate, calculated movement. Matthew's flashlight beam caught something just beneath the surface. Two massive, cylindrical shapes, perfectly aligned, like giant barrels floating just below the water line. We were frozen in place, watching as the shapes paused, then separated. The water around them began to churn, creating waves that pushed against our legs with unnatural force. Then, without warning, another explosive splash erupted behind the shapes, and whatever it was began moving toward us with terrifying speed. That was all we needed. We ran, fighting against the water that suddenly seemed alive, trying to hold us back. Matthew slipped, disappearing briefly beneath the surface before Casey and Olivia hauled him up. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror as he gasped. Something touched me. Something down there touched me. We didn't stop to verify his claim. We scrambled back up the stairs, abandoning our equipment, our bravado, and any pretense of being fearless urban explorers. We didn't stop running until we reached the relative safety of the ground floor, where we huddled, soaking wet and shaking, trying to process what had just happened. In the aftermath, as we sat in the warm safety of Casey's car, we began piecing together what we'd experienced. Local research later hinted at classified military experiments conducted in the facility's lower levels. Attempts to treat PTSD and other trauma through experimental submersion therapy. Some accounts mentioned a massive tank system installed in the basement, designed to simulate the disorientation of underwater combat. But what we saw moved with purpose, with intelligence. The way the water changed when it appeared, from still to churning in seconds, suggested something far more sinister than abandoned equipment or trapped wildlife. The locals who knew about it called it the submersion beast, claiming it was the product of those forgotten experiments, something that had adapted to life in the flooded darkness. I've been in countless abandoned places since then, explored deeper and darker spaces, but I've never felt anything like what lived in those black waters. The way it moved, the deliberate nature of its approach, suggested something that had been waiting for visitors, something that had learned to hunt in the darkness. Ridgemont still stands, slowly decaying on its mountaintop perch. Sometimes, late at night, locals report hearing strange sounds echoing from its depths. Not the usual settling of an old building, but something like massive objects moving through water, creating waves in the perpetual darkness below. The basement remains flooded, its black waters keeping their secrets, waiting for the next group of explorers brave or foolish enough to venture into its depths. Perched atop Mount Sterling in Colorado, where the air grows thin and the stars seem close enough to touch, stands the abandoned Sterling Observatory. Most people pretend it doesn't exist. It's not on any tourist maps, and local hiking guides carefully avoid mentioning it. But if you grew up in the area, you might have heard whispers about the place where the stars spoke back. They say the observatory was built in 1934 by an eccentric astronomer named Frederick Sterling, who claimed this particular mountain peak had unique properties that made it perfect for observing certain celestial phenomena. The main telescope, a massive bronze and steel monster, still points accusingly at the sky through a partially collapsed dome. But it's what lies beneath the observatory that draws urban explorers and thrill seekers. A complex network of underground research chambers that Sterling insisted were essential for his work. Nobody remembers the real Saint Sterling anymore. The name belongs to the mountain now. But the stories persist. They say Sterling disappeared in 1943 after claiming he'd made a breakthrough in his research. Some say he went mad. Others suggest he found something in the stars he wasn't supposed to see. That weekend, Jamie and Jordan Walker convinced me to check it out. The twins were experienced urban explorers like myself, but something about this place made them nervous. The fake door we'd heard about Mora Hatch really had already been smashed open. The splintered wood looked recent, not the result of weather or time. We did our research before going in. The facility had a dark reputation, with scattered mentions of strange equipment found in the underground levels, and stories of homeless people who went missing after seeking shelter there. But nothing concrete, nothing provable, just the kind of urban legends that collect around abandoned places like dust. The entrance led to stone steps spiraling into the earth, each one worn smooth by decades of use. The moment we passed the threshold, everything felt wrong. The air grew heavy, not just thicker due to depth, but somehow more substantial, as if it was actively resisting our presence. Our flashlight beams seemed to fade faster than they should, the darkness eating away at their edges. At the base of the stairs, the passage turned sharply. Jamie tossed a red emergency flare around the corner. The sulfurous light revealed what appeared to be an old research chamber. Rusted metal tables lined the walls, and strange mechanical devices sat covered in decades of dust. The air reeked of mold and something metallic that caught in the back of our throats. Fresh blood smears across the floor led to a darker corridor. At its end was an iron grate covering a shaft that descended even deeper. A rusted ladder disappearing into the blackness. Someone had cut through the heavy chain that once secured it. The three of us climbed down, with Jordan the heaviest going last. Halfway down, the corroded metal gave way with an ear-splitting shriek. The ladder collapsed, and Jordan plummeted to the floor below with a sickening crunch. His scream echoed through the tunnels, bouncing off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. This new level was different. The walls bore strange markings, not graffiti, but complex mathematical equations and astronomical charts carved directly into the stone. We had to carry Jordan, both his ankles shattered, whimpering in pain. With no way back up the broken ladder, we were forced to push forward. We passed dead rats and stranger things. What looked like scientific equipment fused with religious artifacts. Star charts merged with occult symbols. Jamie kept muttering about the angles being wrong, about how the tunnels seemed to curve in ways that didn't make sense. At one point, we had to step around a pile of what looked like old research papers, their pages covered in frantic scribbles about stellar alignments and the voices between stars. At the end of that last tunnel, we found another rusted ladder climbing up into darkness. I went first, every rung groaning under my weight. The hatch above opened into what must have been Sterling's private study. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with astronomy books and stranger texts in languages I didn't recognize. That's when I saw him, slumped in the corner behind a fallen bookcase. He was curled into himself, knees drawn up, arms wrapped tightly around them. One hand was extended, slack, with a needle still embedded in the vein. His eyes were open but saw nothing, fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, beyond the mountain, perhaps beyond the stars themselves. I backed down the ladder and told the others. No one asked if he was dead. We could feel it, like his death had left a stain in the air. Jamie was already pale, clutching a strange amulet he'd found. Jordan had gone quiet, shock and pain glazing his eyes. We managed to get Jordan up through the hatch. It took all of us, and I still don't know how we did it. We found a service door leading outside, half hidden behind decades of overgrowth, and didn't stop moving until we reached the car. The walk down the mountain seemed to take hours, with Jordan leaning heavily on us, each step punctuated by his pained gasps. At the hospital, we told them Jordan had fallen while hiking. The nurse gave us an odd look, but didn't press further. Later, we learned we weren't the first to come down from Mount Sterling with unexplained injuries. We never reported finding the body. How could we explain what we were doing there? But I still think about him, about the way he died alone in that room filled with strange books and stranger equations. What was he looking at in those final moments? What had he found in Sterling's old research that was worth dying for? The observatory still stands, its telescope eternally watching the stars. Sometimes, on clear nights, locals report seeing lights moving in the dome, or hearing strange sounds echoing from deep within the mountain. Not mechanical sounds, but something like voices speaking in frequencies just beyond human hearing. The underground chambers remain unexplored, their secrets safe behind steel doors and stone walls. But sometimes I wonder if that body is still there, or if whatever walks those tunnels has claimed it, adding it to the collection of mysteries buried beneath Mount Sterling. The Beaumont Theater had been a whispered legend in New Orleans' French Quarter for decades. A once magnificent Victorian playhouse, now a decaying skeleton of its former glory. They said it was haunted, the ghosts of long-dead performers still taking their final bows before an audience of shadows. The theater's windows would inexplicably light up at night. Phantom music would drift through its walls, and sometimes passers-by would swear they heard applause from within its empty halls. I'd heard all the stories, but that Halloween night, barely able to walk straight after too many parties in the quarter, I found myself standing in front of its imposing facade with my friend Marcus. The moonlight painted strange shadows across the building's ornate architecture, making the carved faces above the entrance seem to shift and change. We just finished a joint and were laughing about something forgotten when we saw them, two figures walking toward the theater with strange, purposeful grace. There was something off about their movement, too fluid, too precise, like dancers performing a choreographed piece. They reached the main entrance, and with a gentle push that seemed impossibly easy, the heavy doors swung open. Marcus froze beside me. "Wait," he whispered, "that door's always locked. I've tried it 1,000,000 times." The figures disappeared inside, the doors closing behind them with a sound like a satisfied sigh. We stood in stunned silence for a moment before curiosity overcame caution. This might be our only chance to see inside the legendary Beaumont. When we reached the entrance, the door opened at our touch, welcoming us into the darkness beyond. The air inside was different, not musty like you'd expect from an abandoned building, but sweet and heavy, like perfume lingering after a performance. Our phone flashlights revealed glimpses of faded grandeur gold leaf peeling from intricate moldings, threadbare velvet seats, and a massive crystal chandelier hanging precariously above the orchestra pit. The two figures we'd followed were nowhere to be seen. We called out, but our voices were swallowed by the darkness. Then we heard it, laughter echoing from somewhere above us, not malicious, but inviting, like actors sharing a private joke backstage. We climbed the grand staircase, our footsteps muffled by rotting carpets. The second floor opened onto a series of private boxes overlooking the stage. As we walked along the corridor, checking each box, the laughter grew closer. Finally, we found them, a man and woman in period costume, standing in one of the boxes as if waiting for us. Their clothes were impeccable, the man in a perfectly tailored 19th century suit, the woman in a magnificent evening gown that seemed to shimmer despite the darkness. But their faces, there was something wrong about them, like looking at a reflection in troubled water. "Welcome to the Beaumont," the man said, his voice carrying the musical lilt of an aged actor. "We've been expecting you." The woman smiled, but her eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond us. That's when I noticed the strange quality of their presence, how the dim light seemed to pass through them, how their movements left trailing echoes in the air. Marcus must have noticed too, because he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "The show is about to begin," the woman announced, her voice somehow both distant and impossibly close. "You'll want to find your seats." From below, music began to play, not recorded, but live orchestral music, though we'd seen no musicians. The chandelier sparked to life, its crystals casting rainbow patterns across the walls. The theater was transforming around us, decay falling away like an old costume, revealing the splendor that had been hidden beneath. We ran. The music followed us, swelling to a crescendo as we stumbled down the stairs. Behind us, we could hear the sound of an audience filling the theater, hundreds of voices speaking at once, the rustle of phantom clothing, the tap of ghostly shoes on wooden floors. Just before we reached the exit, I looked back. The theater was alive with spectral light, every seat filled with translucent figures in Victorian dress. On stage, actors moved through scenes from a forgotten play, their voices rising and falling in perfect cadence. The two figures we'd followed stood in their private box, watching us with amused expressions, as if we were part of the evening's entertainment. We burst through the doors into the cool night air, running until we reached Bourbon Street's familiar chaos. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, Marcus turned to me. "Did you see?" He started, but couldn't finish the sentence. Later, we learned about the Beaumont's history. On Halloween night in 1893, during a performance of The Phantom of the Opera, ironically enough, a fire broke out backstage. The exits were blocked, and most of the audience and performers perished. They say the lead actress kept singing, even as the flames reached the stage, her final aria becoming a requiem for everyone trapped inside. Some locals claim that every Halloween, the Beaumont's ghostly company performs their final show. They say if you're invited inside, you might witness the performance that never-ended actors and audience locked in an eternal encore. The theater still stands, its dark windows watching the tourists pass by. Sometimes, late at night, people report seeing lights moving behind the boards, hearing music that shouldn't exist, or catching glimpses of figures in Victorian dress disappearing through solid walls. But no one has managed to open those doors since our encounter. I've never returned to the Beaumont, though I pass it often. Sometimes, walking home late at night, I swear I can hear that phantom orchestra tuning up, preparing for a performance that will never truly end. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see those two figures standing in the highest window, still waiting to welcome their next audience into their eternal show. In Northern Ireland, among rolling emerald hills and ancient stone walls, urban exploration has always been more than just a hobby for me and my university friends. We seek out abandoned places not for their haunted reputation, but for their architectural beauty and the stories they hold within their weathered walls. Living in County Antrim means we're surrounded by stunning landscapes, misty mountains, dense forests, and sweeping meadows that seem to stretch endlessly into the horizon. These natural wonders make every exploration feel like stepping into a painting, especially when we discover old structures nestled within this untamed beauty. The Greenwood Manor had become our favorite destination. This Victorian mansion, with its towering chimneys and elaborate stonework, had called to us several times before. However, our latest visit would prove to be drastically different from our previous adventures. I remember that day vividly. Myself and my two closest friends, Tom and Jake, decided to revisit the manor. The autumn wind whistled through the trees, carrying dead leaves in spiraling patterns across our path. The building's condition had deteriorated significantly since our last visit. Nature was steadily reclaiming what man had abandoned, with ivy creeping up the walls and moss carpeting the worn stone steps. Our usual entry point had been sealed shut with fresh boards, and we almost gave up. But as we circled the building, we noticed that part of the lower roof had collapsed, creating an unconventional entrance. Getting up there wasn't easy. We had to carefully climb a sturdy old oak tree and help each other across. The whole time, the wind seemed to whisper warnings through the branches. Inside, things felt different. The familiar rooms we'd explored before now held an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against us from all sides. I've always been sensitive to these things, what some might call spiritually aware, and something felt terribly wrong. Jake, ever the skeptic, brushed off our concerns with logical explanations about air pressure and old house settling. We made our way through the upper floors, cringing at the crude graffiti that vandals had left since our last visit. The once elegant wallpaper hung in sad strips from the walls, and our footsteps echoed ominously on the warped floorboards. As we reached the ground floor, we paused in one of the main hallways to discuss our plans for the rest of the day. We stood in a loose triangle formation. I was leaning against a doorframe, with Tom to my left and Jake to my right. The room behind me was empty, or so I thought. That's when it happened. I felt something touch my back, not a brush or a bump, but a deliberate motion. It felt like fingers, ice cold and purposeful, trailing from the nape of my neck down to the middle of my back. The pressure was firm and consistent until it gradually faded away at my lower back. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The color drained from my face as I leaped forward with a startled cry. Tom and Jake stared at me with confused expressions, asking if I'd hurt myself. The world seemed to spin around me as I tried to form words through my panic. When I finally managed to explain what had happened, Tom's face went pale, but Jake just laughed it off, suggesting I'd backed into something or maybe felt a spider. But I knew better. Just before it happened, every hair on my body had stood on end, as if my body was trying to warn me of what was coming. Tom and I managed to convince Jake it was time to leave, partly because of what had happened, and partly because the temperature had dropped significantly. As we made our way back to our entry point, a new sensation started. A burning feeling traced down my back, exactly where the cold touch had been. It felt like someone was dragging a heated poker down my spine. Growing increasingly worried, I asked Tom to check my back. The look on his face told me something was wrong before he even spoke. He called Jake over to look, and their silence made my anxiety spike. They nervously informed me that there were 3 distinct scratch marks running down my back. I asked them to take a photo, and when I saw it, my blood ran cold. The scratches were deep and angry looking, following the exact path where I'd felt both the cold touch and the burning sensation. Jake, our resident skeptic, initially suggested I must have done it to myself. But after examining the marks more closely, he had to admit that was impossible. The scratches went under my shirt and backpack straps in a way I couldn't have managed on my own. We tried to maintain our composure as we made our way out, but I could feel something watching us. The journey back through the collapsed roof section and down the oak tree felt endless. When we finally reached safe distance, we stopped to look back at the manor. We all agreed never to return, but something about that place still pulls at me. It's like an itch I can't scratch, a mystery I can't solve. Maybe it's the eeriness that draws me back, or perhaps it's the need to understand what happened that day. Or maybe, just maybe, whatever left those marks on my back wants me to return. My friend and I experienced something truly inexplicable. that turned even the most hardened skeptic into a believer. We were sitting in my SUV outside my friend's house on a winter evening around 9 o'clock. The night was crystal clear, but darkness had fully settled in, wrapping the suburban street in deep shadows. There were 5 of us in the vehicle. I was in the driver's seat with my friend Marcus beside me, while 3 others, David, Emma, and Jack, occupied the back seats. We were engaged in casual conversation when suddenly, an intense sensation crawled up my spine. It felt like we were being watched, that unmistakable feeling when unseen eyes are fixed upon you. I turned to Marcus in the passenger seat, and at that exact moment, he looked at me with wide eyes, his face pale as if he'd seen something terrifying. I asked if he had felt it too, and he nodded silently. Strangely, our 3 friends in the back seat remained completely oblivious to whatever was happening. We tried to shake off the feeling and continued our conversation, but minutes later, the sensation returned even stronger than before. Marcus suddenly stared past me, through my window, and his voice trembled as he warned me not to turn around. The others still noticed nothing, but Marcus and I both sensed a presence outside the vehicle. Without looking, we began describing to each other what we were sensing. It was pure white and humanoid in form, but the details seem hazy in my memory. Then things got even stranger. Marcus and I both felt the presence circling the vehicle, and we began to perceive green luminous circles moving rapidly around the car. It's difficult to explain. We couldn't exactly see them, but we knew they were there. The circles started moving faster and faster, and panic began to rise in our throats. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, the circles vanished. Marcus and I were leaning back to talk to our friends in the back seat when movement caught our eye. On the sidewalk behind the car, there was a brilliant flash of white light, and a creature sprinted toward us. It was pure white, bipedal but definitely not human, incredibly tall and unnaturally thin. I would estimate it stood at least 7 feet tall. Its head was oddly shaped, like the letter H, with long, dark hair hanging down and black eyes that seemed to absorb what little light there was. Its hands ended in sharp, claw-like fingers. Marcus and I screamed simultaneously. I started the car and drove away as fast as I could. Once we were far from that place, we compared our descriptions of what we'd seen, and they matched perfectly. I dropped everyone off at their homes, but the presence followed me. At every stop sign and traffic light, I could feel it catching up, so I sped the rest of the way home. Only when I finally reached my driveway did the sensation fade. Both Marcus and I sensed that whatever this entity was, it hadn't meant to harm us. It seemed more interested in making its presence known. Nothing like this has happened before or since. The only connection we could think of between us was that we were both raised in religious households, though I'm not sure if that's relevant. Looking back now, I can't explain what we encountered that night. Some have suggested it might have been a Wendigo or another mythical creature, but I don't think we can accurately classify what we saw. Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on our memories and changed our perspective on what might exist in the shadows of our world. My friend and I were saved from certain death in a snowstorm by what I can only describe as phantom helpers. We were driving back to Arizona from visiting his family in Colorado when we got caught in a severe snowstorm in the Texas Panhandle. We were traveling on Route 33, just outside a small town called Riverside, when our little Toyota slid off the road and into a ditch. We tried everything we could think of digging around the tires, using floor mats for traction, but nothing worked. Through the swirling snow, we could see what appeared to be lights from a farmhouse nearby. Despite it being 2 in the morning, we decided to risk knocking on the door rather than freezing to death in the brutal winter storm. A tiny elderly woman answered the door. And when I say tiny, I mean she couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall. She looked ancient, with deep wrinkles etched into her face like the rings of an old tree. We explained our situation and asked about the distance to the next town. Her equally diminutive husband, barely 5 feet tall himself, emerged from behind her and said he'd pull us out with thunder, and told us to follow him to the barn. Inside the weathered barn was an old Ford pickup truck, complete with a CB radio and a revolver tucked into the front seat pocket. We all climbed into the cab, and the old man patted the dashboard affectionately, saying, "Come on, Thunder." He then proceeded to drive us to where we'd gone off the road and pulled our car out of the ditch with seemingly impossible ease. We made it to Riverside and stayed in the most run-down motel I've ever seen, sleeping on top of the covers fully clothed because of the questionable cleanliness. The next day, we continued our journey back to Arizona without further incident. Since I frequently traveled Route 33, I planned to stop by during daylight hours to drop off a thank you gift for the elderly couple. Here's where things get strange, just outside of Riverside, Texas. Near that curve where we went off the road, there is no house. No tiny elderly couple, no barn, no thunder. I've driven past that spot at least a dozen times since that night in December, and I've even pulled up the area on satellite maps. There's absolutely no trace of them. My friend and I eventually came to the conclusion that whatever saved us that night wasn't entirely of this world. Whether they were guardian angels or some other kind of benevolent spirits, they appeared when we needed help most and vanished without a trace afterward. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I'm grateful for their intervention on that cold winter night. This encounter happened to me and my best friend back in 2007 or 2008. We were both women in our early 20s, sharing an apartment in a metropolitan area. Not quite a major city, but definitely not a small town either. Behind our apartment complex, through a short stretch of woods, there was a neighborhood of single-family homes. It was a typical suburban cul-de-sac, middle-class American neighborhood, except for one crucial detail. It was completely unoccupied. This was during the height of the financial crisis, and the effects of the recession were evident everywhere. A developer had purchased the entire neighborhood with plans to demolish everything. They'd managed to construct a gleaming new access road from the main street to the neighborhood. But then the money apparently dried up before the homes could be demolished. This wasn't unusual. There were several stalled construction projects in the area that had met the same fate. The immediate area was isolated, no shops, stores, or gas stations nearby. Just empty residential homes. It was a bit eerie, but not overtly creepy. Given our retail jobs and irregular schedules, my best friend and I often had free time during daylight hours. We'd frequently go on walks through this abandoned neighborhood, following a short path through the woods that led to the main neighborhood street. The road started as gravel and transitioned to asphalt toward the newer end of the neighborhood with the larger houses. We'd stroll up and down the streets, chatting and occasionally sharing a cigarette, just being young and carefree. One of the properties had several acres of land, with a large field where we'd sometimes take blankets and lie down to relax. On the day of this encounter, the sun was shining brilliantly in a crystal clear blue sky, probably late summer or early fall. Despite the neighborhood's slightly unsettling atmosphere, we felt relatively safe in the bright daylight. We were on one of our usual midday walks when we spotted a car heading in our direction. This was the first time we'd ever seen a vehicle there. It was a small blue hatchback. Neither of us got a clear look at the driver's face, but we could see two people in the car. All I could make out was that the driver was male, white, with brown hair, wearing a blue and white striped shirt. The car rumbled past us on the gravel road and disappeared from sight. We continued walking, thinking it was odd but not particularly alarming. A few minutes later, the car returned from the direction it had gone, passing us from behind. It drove out of sight over a small hill, and we figured they'd probably gotten lost, since there was obviously nothing of interest on this road, except the abandoned subdivision. We kept walking for another couple of minutes, until we reached the small hill. As we got to the top, we saw the car that had just driven past us. It was stopped on the road a little way ahead, just sitting there with its brake lights on. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The passenger was gone. I started questioning whether I'd actually seen a passenger at all until my friend said, "Wasn't there another person?" My internal alarm bells started ringing, and I felt deeply unsettled. Something about the way that car was just idling there, as if waiting for us, felt terribly wrong. There was nothing behind us where they could have dropped off their passenger, which made their absence even more disturbing. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at this car, possibly with the driver's accomplice having been dropped off behind us, and the car in front lying in wait. It felt like an eternity. A cold, heavy feeling settled in my stomach. My friend and I were both frozen in place, the hair on the backs of our necks standing up, mental alarm bells screaming. As the reality of our situation dawned on me, that no one knew where we were, and I was calculating how long it would be until my boyfriend got off work and discovered us missing. The car suddenly started backing up toward us at high speed. As the vehicle accelerated backward, my friend and I finally snapped out of our paralysis and bolted toward the woods, cutting through the backyard of one of the abandoned houses. We frantically pushed our way through the short stretch of woods and emerged on the opposite side of our apartment complex, running at full speed until we reached our building. I never learned what that driver's intentions were, what their plan had been, or where their passenger had disappeared to, but I'm certain we narrowly escaped something terrible that day. I saw something terrifying many years ago, and I'm still amazed to discover that others have encountered similar creatures. I was in 7th grade at the time. I'm now preparing to start university. The incident occurred during a particularly harsh winter in my family's old farmhouse. I shared a room with my younger brother, sleeping in a bunk bed where I had claimed the top bunk. During summer months, we would install window screens to help with ventilation. Being a light sleeper, I woke up one night to hear an odd rhythmic scratching on the screen, accompanied by raspy breathing. I rolled onto my stomach and carefully peered over the side of my bed. What I saw makes my blood run cold even now. There was a creature exactly like others have described, extremely pale and unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs. It had no clothing or hair, and its face was flat and round. I couldn't make out a nose or visible ears, just very thin lips. The eyes were deeply sunken. At the time I thought they were glowing, but now I believe it was just Aishin from the ambient light. The entity was lightly scratching at the screen, looking around the room with an unsettling casualness. It wasn't trying to break in. It seemed more interested in making noise. I watched it in silent terror for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. Eventually, I managed to crawl backwards down the ladder and fled to the living room, where I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch. The height of the creature was particularly disturbing. It had to have been at least 7 feet tall because it was hunched over at the window, and the window itself was about 5 feet off the ground. A few months later, during a camping trip with my scout troop, I encountered something similar. One of the scouts' families owned property in a remote area. I live in northern Michigan, and we had set up camp deep in their forest. I woke up in our large family tent to hear that same distinctive scratching, long and rhythmic, on the nylon material. I could see impressions of long fingers being made on the tent wall. I lay there quietly until it moved away, and then I heard it repeating its process on other tents in the campsite before wandering off. I kept silent until the next morning when my father pulled me aside and said he had heard the same thing, which had woken him up as well. One final detail that still haunts me. Before we went to sleep in our tents that night, there was a long, haunting scream from the woods. It sounded like a hybrid of a human and some animal being killed, one final howl of pain. Everything fell silent afterward. Keep in mind that these were experienced woodsmen, and they hadn't heard anything like that before in their lives. Fox vocalizations are noticeably canine. Mountain lion sounds are distinctly feline. This was entirely unnatural. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.